My name is David Stauberg. I'm Dean of Humanities here at UCLA. I'm also a scholar of early Chinese literature, which necessarily involves a certain amount of research on inscribed artifacts from the first millennium BC. So the comparative elements of this conference are especially interesting to me. I'd like to say a few words about the Division of Humanities at UCLA, of the place of Iranian studies in the division, and of prospects for the future. The Division of Humanities comprises 15 departments and a number of centers. It's been characterized, I would say, by a great investment of the people in California over the past 10 decades at this point, in the study of every aspect of human language and culture from around the world, from archaic times to the present. There have been special investments, and especially appropriate to the West Coast, in Asian studies. There have been investments in the study of antiquity through archaeology and through philology. And quite notably, there have been, for the past 50 years, very serious investments in the study of Iranian and Persian antiquity. We're very proud of this legacy. Of course, it owes a great deal to our late colleague, Professor Hossein Ziai, whose sad passing in the summer of 2011 left us at a kind of crossroads. And I remember I was coming in just at that moment to the position of dean, as an interim dean, have a chance for a year to work at this job, to see how I would like it, to see how it would like me. And even before the appointment began, the very first meeting I had was a meeting about the very great importance of setting out immediately to replace Professor Ziai so as to maintain the achievements that had been created here at UCLA over a period of many years. We moved, by the way, that meeting was with Professor Schneedewind, whom I'll introduce in a moment. We moved on that suggestion. We moved to maintain the momentum and to keep Iranian studies here alive. Of course, our senior scholar, Professor Rahim Shayagan, was in place already at that time. We set out to search for a new member of the faculty, and last year we're very happy to welcome to the faculty Professor Domenico Ingenito, who's here today. All of this is part of a project that should make a great deal of sense to the people who are here, including both the scholars and the students, who I say sitting at the back of the room. Los Angeles is a city that, arguably more than almost any other city in the world, deserves to have a first-rate program in the study of Iran in all aspects of its history, its culture, society, language, politics. This is a community that represents the Iranian people in exile in all of the Iranian people's various communities. That's a community that, in its exile status, surrounds the UCLA campus in the communities nearby, and that for years has shown its support and participation in the academic things that are going on here in this building and in the building across the quad, where Near Eastern languages and cultures is housed. Over the last year or two, working with Professor Schneedewind and Professor Shayagan, several of us have begun a renewed effort to put in place a real monument to the importance of Iranian studies here at UCLA, and to create something that, for decades to come, will continue to focus attention on this crucial place in the world and in the world's history. I think we're on a very good track for that. I think the evidence is here in the room, both in the scholars who've come together for today's conference and in the students who, as students of Iranian studies, are already coming to embody a future for this scholarly field. And I must say I've been thrilled to see how the tour of the Cyrus Cylinder across the United States has attracted attention. I had a conversation with a friend in Washington who was closely associated with the Freer-Sackler effort, who pointed out to me that the site for the Cyrus Cylinder there had garnered some 1 billion hits several months after the exhibit. And I find that figure quite striking. The Cyrus cylinder is a special artifact in that it seems to come back into history and to betoken a humanistic ideal for inclusion, for autonomy, self-determination, and it's little wonder that here in the United States it has attracted so much attention from people who are so committed to an ongoing history of humanistic ideals. That, at least, is how the Cyrus cylinder looks to a Dean of Humanities and a scholar of early China. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to introduce now Professor Bill Schniedewind, who is the chair of our Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. As I mentioned, he's the person who approached me almost immediately and said, we must replace Professor Zion because we must keep this strong program alive. I'm grateful to him for that. I'm grateful to the community for its continuing support.
Well, let me just start by welcoming everyone here on behalf of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures. I'm obviously Bill Schniedewind, and I want to thank David Skalberg, the Dean of Humanities, for the unwavering support they've had for the department and for Iranian studies over the last, not just the last few years. I mean, certainly David and I worked very closely together when he became dean to continue the legacy of Iranian studies at UCLA. But the support of the university for Iranian studies has really been remarkable. I've been the chair of the NELC department for on and off for 10 years, and actually started as chair, like, I don't know, it seems like in my early youth. It was several years, it was a lot of years ago. It's a notion that I'm beginning to have gray hair, and none of it's really a result of Iranian studies. But over the course of the last decade or so, I've seen a lot of ebbs and flows in the economy of the state of California. I've seen cutbacks and attempts to sort of revive the economy, the university budgets, and yet through it all, I've seen the department supported by the administration in ways that is really encouraging. And I've seen the department supporting Iranian studies from the dean's office and from the college and from the chancellor's office. On every level, I've seen that support. And I think it's reflected in some of the success of the Iranian Studies program and the department at UCLA. I'm really happy to say this is the 50th year now for the Iranian Studies program at UCLA. 50 years ago, this academic year, we established an Iranian Studies major at UCLA. And so this is sort of a historic year in that respect. And the Iranian Studies program has a lot of people to thank, from the administration down to founders like Professor Amin Banani, who was instrumental in founding the major in the department. Professors like Hans-Peter Schmidt, who was one of the early Iranists who established the field of ancient Iranian studies, which brings us to our current topic. Professor Zia and I worked very closely together in the establishment of all sorts of branching out of the field of Iranian studies, so it wasn't narrowly defined at UCLA, but it was very inclusive. He helped establish endowed chairs, the Musicard chair, the Sabi chair, Musa Sabi chair in Iranian studies that Professor Elizabeth Carter, who's an archaeologist of ancient Iran, currently holds. We have endowed chairs, the Taslimi family, endowed chair in Baha'i studies. We have an endowment in Judeo-Persian at UCLA. So the gamut of what we're able to do, not only from the support of the administration, but also from the support of the community, is really remarkable. It covers all the fields of Iranian studies, and it's something that we can be really proud of at UCLA. It's also really nice for me that we are having this particular conference on a topic that touches both on my own field of specialty, which is biblical studies, and Iranian studies. And the figure of Cyrus the Great is a figure that in some ways transcends history. The fact that his cylinder is ensconced in a replica in the Library of Congress is sort of a testimony to the way he transcends history in some ways. But also, it's a figure that brings together the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, not only in the borders of the Persian Empire, but in the legacy and the reception of Cyrus that we want to talk about over the next couple days. So it's really a personal pleasure to me that we can bring this international conference here to UCLA. And the person I have most to thank for that is Professor Rahim Shaigan, who is a professor of Iranian studies at UCLA. He did the yeoman's work in putting together this conference, and I'm really pleased to have him as my colleague, and we're really fortunate to have him here at UCLA representing Iranian studies. Professor Shaigan.
I thank you very much, Bill and David, for the gracious introductions. I would not take much of your time since the coffee is awaiting us. Suffice it to say that I'm very happy to be serving the program of Iranian Studies in the last 2 years, first as an acting and as a director of the program, and to bring together all these different layers of Iranian Studies together and organize this conference, which is not only about Cyrus, but also its reception in the late antique period. It is true that this year is the 50th year of Iranian Studies. It was created by German emigres coming from Europe and establishing an old-fashioned, philologically based program, doctoral program. We have moved beyond that by now, and it is my pleasure to mention that Professor Ingenito, my colleague in Persian Studies, is now in the 3rd generation representing Iranian Studies at UCLA, and I am the direct successor to Hans-Peter Schmidt, great Indianist, although I cannot attain the same rigor. But be it as it may, this conference is somewhat about, not so much about the cylinder of Cyrus, although it is obviously playing a very important role because the cylinder is right now here at Los Angeles, in Los Angeles. It is about Cyrus, and while reading the abstract of my esteemed friend Reni Boucharla, I realized that basically he has stated what I intended to do by far better in a few words. We always forget who Cyrus was, because Darius is such an important figure, the successor to Cyrus, and because so much of the administration, all of the structures of the empire owes to him, or at least that is our impression. And it is difficult to find exactly the administrative functions or the beyond the empire building, but also the structures that Cyrus the Great had set in and passed on to Darius I. So this conference is the first part of it, discovering Cyrus again, to see what he has done and what he might have done. And that is in the opaque world that is the Achaemenid Empire, dominated by the figure of Darius I. And in the second half, that is second day, to also capture the reception of Cyrus in the entire ancient world, be it the Greco-Roman world, be it the Hellenistic world, be it the Arsacid and later Sasanian worlds, as well as the Muslim era, especially in the Arabic historiography, where he is by far more present than in the Persian literature. So this conference owes primarily to our dear and esteemed colleagues and guests who have come here to honor us and to discover together this emblematic figure, and also to the many who have indeed honored us with their presence in the auditors and the audience that we very much appreciate here. Thank you so much. Thank you. Two first panelists.
It's my very great pleasure to introduce two, I guess I could say, two very good friends who have worked long and hard on Cyrus. Professor David Stronach is well known as the excavator of Pasargadae, the capital of Cyrus, and Dr. Matthew Waters is teaching at the University of Wisconsin, and he has written on a number of articles on Cyrus from the philological point of view. So here in this little panel, we have an archaeological and a philological point of view on Cyrus. Who's first?
According to the program.
Good. Matthew Waters, I've known since he was a student at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've pondered long and hard his dissertation, which is basically on the Neo-Elamite world and the background of Cyrus. He ended up in a classics department, and after studying Near Eastern philology, has now turned more toward classical philology. I don't know the title of his talk because I'm just filling in here, but he'll tell it to you, and I know it's about Cyrus, and I know his articles that he's written. So without further ado, Matthew Waters, University of Wisconsin.
I'd like to start by extending thanks to the Farhang Foundation, Iran Heritage Foundation America, and the Sanamni Hamni Foundation for support of this conference, and of course to UCLA, and in particular Rahim Shagan, for the invitation to speak here, to participate in this wonderful event celebrating a Cyrus Cylinders exhibition at the Gateway. The hospitality and conviviality so far have been tremendous, and I fully expect that to continue. Asked to discuss the early Persians period history, it seemed appropriate to revisit not only some of the preliminaries leading to the Persians' rise, but also to consider some of the relevant historiographic issues associated with Cyrus the Great's own achievements and legacy, and hopefully set the stage. Over several centuries, in the early first millennium in Fars, a synthesis of Persian and Elamite groups resulted in a demographic dynamic that forged the Achaemenid Persian Empire in the latter half of the 6th century. A variety of data testifies to the cultural components of the so-called Persian Elamite ethnogenesis, but the extant archaeological and documentary evidence is disjointed. Thus, construction of a cohesive historical narrative for the Neo-Elamite period, circa 1000 to 550 BC, is a challenge, and that, I emphasize, is an understatement. This applies especially to that last formative century, from the sack of Susa by Ashurbanipal's armies in 646 to Cyrus the Great's conquest of the Medes in 550, though continuing survey, excavation, and some spectacular finds, such as the famous tomb of Arjan, hold promise of further advances. Several kings are attested in Neo-Elamite texts during the century that immediately preceded the rise of Cyrus. But beyond their names, there is little indication of the places, extent, or even chronology of their rules. It remains to be determined how Cyrus the Great's forebears, labeled by Cyrus in his cylinder as kings of Anshan, fit into this milieu. One might assume that Cyrus's predecessors incorporated or conquered some territory beyond Fars, or Anshan, which laid the groundwork for Cyrus's future expansion. But such an assumption is currently impossible to verify on the ground. Thus, to resort to some cliched phraseology, we are in a dark age, for which the barest indicators of political history remain mostly static, a variety of known unknowns awaiting additional evidence in order to allow additional clarification. The subtitle of my talk alludes to the basic difficulties with which we yet grapple. Nuances of given words and their context, representations of royal titles and epithets and their significance, and geographic names that appear to shift over time with regard to what areas they refer. This is just a sampling of some of the documents. Of course, the Cyrus cylinder at the top, the Nabonidus Chronicle, and Cyrus's brick inscription from Ur, which we'll talk more about later. These occur in a number of disparate sources. These issues, I should say. Royal inscriptions, chronicles, administrative documents, and sealings, among others, from a chronological range encompassing over 200 years. Some specific examples include whether a particular king was killed or just defeated by Cyrus in 547, or whether the Babylonian army or people were killed, even slaughtered in some translations, or again just defeated after Cyrus's victory at Opis in 539. This is both in reference to the word Daku in the Nabonidus Chronicle. Whether the temples that Cyrus restored after his conquest of Babylonia were age-old or had been abandoned for a long time, the word Nadu in the Cyrus cylinder. Whether Cyrus was the great-grandson or merely a descendant, however that is to be understood, of Teispes, the word Liblibru, again in the Cyrus cylinder. Fine distinctions in the translation and interpretation of these words carry much significance for our understanding of early Persian history. Consideration of these issues, of course, is hardly new, and that is another understatement. They have occupied modern scholarship for generations. To torture this data yet again for additional insights may strike some as a fool's errand, and I cannot help but wonder if that's why I was asked. Nevertheless, we persist, since Cyrus the Great's formation of the First Persian Empire is so fundamentally important in world history, and so many important questions remain unresolved. Placing strict geographic demarcations upon Elam, I imagine that in quotes, during this period remains an elusive goal. We must also contend with the terms Anzan, or is usually normalized Anshan, and Parsa, as well as Assyrian versions of the latter, Parsuash and Parsumash. The answer to the question, how do we define the wider territories referred to by Anshan, or Susa, or Parsa, or even Elam itself, for that matter, depends upon historical period. Just as an example, this is a nice map I thought from a recent study that covers the whole of Elamite history and differentiating Susa, or Susiana, and Anshan from an Elam, which is, at that earlier period, is a nebulous term that refers to the highlands. And the same map, although the font has changed and there are a few other modifications, reflects the same geographic area, same places, but with the terminology or labels, Susiana becomes Elam, Anshan becomes Parsa, as reflected, for example, in the satrapy lists of the Achaemenid period. In other words, and this is only one way to cast it, how do we get from Anzan and Shushun, prominent in several Middle Elamite kings' titles, to the Achaemenid Persian satrapies of Parsa and Uja? This latter is Elam. Further still, how do we avoid the inevitable morass stemming from comparisons of varying labels, from varying sources, of varying dates? And for the short term, frankly, I intend to simply press on and hope for the best. As for Cyrus the Great himself, he tells us in his inscriptions that he was king of Anshan. So we have a Persian king using what appears to be an Elamite characterized title, extant only in Babylonian inscriptions. Why Anshan? The easiest answer to that question is because that is what he was. King of Anshan, a term applied in its geographical sense both to an important Elamite city and the region around it. Lacking expressions of Cyrus's homegrown titles, the inscriptions of Pasargadae and Cyrus's names CMA and CMC notwithstanding, we have no evidence for how Cyrus presented himself in Fars. Among whatever other considerations may be germane, and there's no shortage, his use of the title King of Anshan in Babylonian inscriptions strikes me as an odd choice if Cyrus did not use the same at home. So let us consider this title and place Anshan further in its geopolitical context. While evidence from the Neo-Elamite period is limited, we have from earlier periods abundant examples of a variety of royal titles and epithets. Prominent among Middle Elamite royal titles was King of Anshan and Susa. It persisted in inscriptions at least a couple Neo-Elamite kings, occasionally supplemented with the also and traditional title Expander of the Realm, though the plain title King, with no indication of what or of where, is most common in extant Neo-Elamite texts. The title King of Anshan and Susa refers to the two main cities of a greater Elamite kingdom. Its use presumably implies control of both the areas and the surrounding regions, or at least the claim to do so. The reality, of course, may have been different. In the Neo-Elamite period, although the evidence is seldom straightforward, Shutruk Nahunta II may have claimed it legitimately. He's the first on the list there. While its use by a certain Atta Hamiti in Shushanak, about whom we know very little, seems rhetorical, since he seems to come much later in the sequence. Assyrian and Babylonian documentation, especially the former, remain the main sources for Elam's political history, especially for the period circa 720 to 640 BC. With few exceptions, for example, the king of Hidalu, mentioned for the year 653, these sources refer to a king of Elam, quote unquote, a description that appears to be more a label than any attempt to reproduce a formal Elamite title. In Assyrian and Babylonian texts, Anshan and Susa do not occur as applied in Elamite titles, or as applied to Elamite rulers, but are geographic markers only, and the former occurs infrequently. That takes the transition from the Neo-Elamites down into the Assyrians with the various Sargonic kings. I'll talk about a couple of examples. Also, I should note, gets us to Parsumash. In the late 8th century, suddenly, to our eyes at least, we begin finding references in Assyrian texts to Parsumash, or Parsumashians, if you prefer, referring to Persians and Fars. Parsumash being a place distinct from the province of Parsuwa in the central western Zagros, northwest of the Mahidash. The earliest reference to Parsumash is an intriguing one. It's right here on the slide. A report dating to the reign of Sargon concerning the Elamite-Assyrian struggle for Illipi. Letter CT 53, 110 plus, publishes SAA 15, number 129. The writer reports that the Elamite king, this is Shutruk Nahunta II, is en route toward Beit Bunaki, a place located somewhere north of Susa and east of Dare, and that he has dispatched a messenger to Parsumash to determine if a specific individual, whose name very unfortunately is broken away, but we have the last sign so that we know it ends in Ya, if this individual will mobilize troops. But what is going on here? I wish that were not just a rhetorical question. Are we seeing some sort of Elamite-Persian cooperation against Assyria? And please note that the word cooperation is really a speculation or extrapolation, a word choice implying an interpretation of a very broken and isolated context. And even if the word choice is appropriate, there's currently no way to discern whether any such cooperation was mandatory or voluntary. Perhaps the most discussed reference to the earliest Persians and Fars is the listing of those forces arrayed against Sennacherib at the Battle of Halul in 691. A number of places and peoples under the aegis of the Elamite king Humban Menadin. Both Parsuash, a variant of Parsumash, and Anshan are listed as separate entities, and whether of any significance or not, first in a long list. Since Assyria controlled the areas north of Illipi at this time, including the Assyrian province of Parsuwa, it is understood that both Sargon's Parsumash and Sennacherib's Parsuwash, it's not a misprint up there, that's represented how they're spelled in Akkadian texts, but they must be in Fars. References in correspondence from Ashurbanipal's reign, sporadic, tantalizing, but after more than a 40-year gap in our material, at least about this particular topic, allude to the interactions between Elamites and Persians in the Zagros foothills stretching towards Fars. We lack sufficient data here again, unfortunately, to contextualize reference to the transport of prisoners and skirmishes between Elamite and Persian forces, but thus we witness, if only at a superficial level, an ongoing Persian-Elamite engagement. This brings me to the first Cyrus, more specifically the King Hurash of Parsumash, who made obeisance to Ashurbanipal around 640, along with a certain, usually overlooked, King Puslume of a place called Hudimiri. The encounter is preserved in two of Ashurbanipal's inscriptions, Prism H2 from Babylon, and another in 3 copies, according to Thompson, from the Ishtar Temple in Nineveh. Puslume of Hudimiri is overlooked because he is otherwise lost to history. Cyrus of Parsumash, of course, is another story, and another long story in the annals of modern scholarship. This Cyrus is sometimes identified as Cyrus the Great's grandfather, although that identification, on chronological and other grounds, is rejected by some and a matter of ongoing debate. Thus note the question marks of the equal signs. It's hard for me to see at this angle, but on both sides. There is less debate on the identification of Cyrus of the seal impression PFS 93 from the Persepolis Fortification Archive, the sealing of Cyrus the Anshionite, the son of Tispes. Here, almost all acknowledge, we have Cyrus the Great's grandfather, who labels himself as Anshionite, or from Anshan. And this label, Anshionite, offers historians an indirect link to Cyrus the Great's preference in royal title, King of Anshan, although the significance of any proposed link vis-a-vis the traditional Elamite title, King of Anshan and Susa, is not straightforward. You can see the complexities here. It's certainly not straightforward to me. Before Cyrus adopted traditional Mesopotamian, especially Assyrian titles in the Cyrus cylinder in line 20, it's up on the screen, he is the king of Anshan. His predecessors listed in his genealogy in line 21 of the cylinder are also each king of Anshan. What exactly that meant in geopolitical terms is unclear, as noted previously. We cannot be certain, though it is assumed by some and must be considered that Cyrus may have exaggerated his predecessor's titular prestige. This is by adding the appellative Great King, King of Anshan, to his progenitors' names through Tispes. It was essential, after all, for Cyrus to have been of an eternal line, a perpetual seed of kingship, in Akkadian Zerodarush Asherutu, in line 22. Just as it was for his Babylonian predecessors to be so, the phrasing is traditional in Mesopotamian texts, and just as it was subsequently important for Darius to claim the same, with the same phrasing in Akkadian in the Babylonian version of his P-Satu inscription. Continuity of royal ancestry, along with continuity of tradition, was of paramount importance. The term in the Cyrus cylinder, line 21, that describes Cyrus's relationship to Tispes is written logographically Sha-3 Baal-Baal. Probably doesn't mean very much. We do know in Akkadian means lib-libu. Word choice matters here in translation because its meaning was clearly fluid. The entry in the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary contains references for lib-libu used to refer to grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, and descendant. Which translation of lib-libu is appropriate then in the Cyrus cylinder? The Akkadian term must remain ambiguous in and of itself, specificity allowed only in context if we have it. However, if it is accepted that Kurash the Anshionite of PFS 93, who explicitly identifies himself as the son of Tispes, if we accept that this is indeed Cyrus the Great's grandfather, we have some external context to tempt us. In other words, identification of the two Cyruses has been used to guide word choice in translation and historical reconstruction. This is the same slide we saw previously. I note the circularity here of basing the translation of lib-libu in the Cyrus cylinder upon a presumed identification with Cyrus the Anshionite of PFS 93. The word choice guides the historical interpretation, but it must be qualified. And that is not the end of it, although I know you were probably all hoping. As several commentators have noted, Cyrus the Anshionite of PFS 93 does not call himself a king. When considered with Cyrus's genealogy in the Cyrus cylinder and the royal titles given to his predecessors, the anomaly begs for reconciliation. Unless one is prepared to insert another 2 generations into the line to account for an extra Cyrus, son of an extra Tispes, and some are prepared to do just that, but I leave such formulations to those more creative than I, then it seems difficult to read lib-libu as anything other than great-grandfather here. Nevertheless, as much as my personal inclination is to remove the question mark above the equal sign on the right, quite frankly both of them for that matter, it must be acknowledged that other interpretations are possible. Let us leave behind that particularly vexing and convoluted issue, focus on Cyrus the Great himself and the compositional subtleties of his Babylonian inscriptions. Those of the cylinder, I trust, will continue to be revisited in great effect in conjunction with this wonderful event, and I have only a little to add in the time remaining to me. In an article I published 3 years ago, although the journal date is 2008, I keyed on one short phrase in line 31 of the cylinder. that dealt with the wider questions of Cyrus's return of the gods to their sanctuaries. Sanctuaries described as an Akkadian Ishtu Panama Nadu. The ambiguity concerns primarily the translation of the relevant verb nadu, on which the adverbial phrase Ishtu Panama relies. The question being whether the sanctuaries were established a long time ago, this is standard commentary on their antiquity, or whether they had been abandoned in ruins for a long time. This is also standard commentary, meaning here the vilification of Cyrus's predecessor Nabonidus and his neglect of the proper forms. The verb itself carries both connotations. Translations of the passage vary, and at the time of that publication, I chose the first option with some ambivalence. The same verb, though in different form, occurs in the cylinder in line 10 in a context where neglect is more clearly implied. But there are several words that may be used to describe neglect, abandonment, or dilapidation, and I dare say that nadu is not necessarily the most common. Others frequently used include labaru, anahu, and aneshu. In any case, I am now of the mind to retain, even embrace, some ambiguity here. The word chosen by Cyrus, his agents, or his scribes, whoever was directly responsible for such things. I embrace not the word nadu's ambiguity purposely for its ambiguity. For Cyrus, then, the temples were age-old, and yet simultaneously, in the recent past, neglected by the inept and unworthy Nabonidus. Cyrus may thus be allowed to have demonstrated his respect for Babylonian norms through both the righting of previous wrongs as well as his acknowledgement and maintenance of proper tradition. This is his inscription on a brick, stamped inscription from Ur, and there's also we have one of the originals in the Getty exhibit. That's the one from the British Museum. This one is from Penn, not to be biased at all, but the last line on this one's a little bit clearer. Having become more, or perhaps too, T-O-O, comfortable with ambiguity, and especially in consideration of this event, admiring Cyrus's genius, I move to my final point. I emphasize that this is an observation, not an assertion, based on a limited sample, and offered in context of an ongoing search for precise antecedents in wording. To the point. In Cyrus's Ur-brick inscription, after Cyrus tells us who he is and whose son he is, the sum total of it runs, "The great gods delivered to me all the lands, and I caused the land to live in peace." The clause "Shukti neti usheshib" in line 6 refers to the establishment, and by implication maintenance, of peace and security. The sentiment is frequently found in Mesopotamian texts. Examples from royal inscriptions date even to the Old Babylonian period. The phrasing is found in the inscriptions of Hammurabi and Samsu-Iluna, and recurs through Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian inscriptions occasionally as well. It is applied in a variety of ways, but most frequently to describe the settlement of peoples in cities or regions, or of gods in their sanctuaries. In other words, this phrasing too is traditional, although the Ur-brick presents what appears to be a slight reformulation. Cyrus tells us that he has conquered multiple lands and established peace, again all expressed as per good Babylonian tradition. In the Cyrus cylinder line 36, almost the same phrasing refers to establishing peace for all the lands, emphasis on the plural. The title King of Lands, usually written with a double kur, as it is here in line 4, is ubiquitous in Babylonian economic and administrative documents of the Achaemenid period, and it has antecedents in, for example, Assyrian royal titles and epithets as well. Darius I and his successors used it frequently in royal inscriptions too, but the focus there during the Achaemenid period, post-Darius, with Darius and thereafter, has been primarily on understanding its Old Persian counterpart, the word dahyu, dahyava in the plural, whether peoples or lands are at issue. In the Ur-brick inscription, once all the lands, plural, are delivered to Cyrus by the gods, observe that what Cyrus establishes in peace and security is one land. Why is the kur sign not repeated in line 6, that's the red boxes here, as it is at the end of line 4? The signs are reasonably clear, have been collated, and the hand drawing, this is from the original publication, is accurate. Is the kur meant to be understood in line 6 as a plural? This is, of course, possible and hardly unprecedented, but this event seems to me a good place to consider the not-so-fine line between 1, a scribal mistake or economy, and 2, subtlety or nuance of expression. As we have it, we move literally from lands, plural, to one land. An equivalent conceptualization of one land or one earth has also, and this will really surprise you at this stage, been much discussed. But that discussion also has focused on Darius I and his successors, and the subsequent Achaemenid imperial vision. It is based on the interpretation, word choice if you will, of Old Persian bumi, earth, as put forth primarily by Clarice Herrenschmidt some years ago and forcefully reasserted more recently by Bruce Lincoln, by whom the concept is considered within a Zoroastrian or Mazdaean context, tying it to elements of creation myths. Conceptions of universality were hardly new. The title King of Lands may be considered one manifestation of it. Cyrus also expressed it via the title King of the World, or King of the Universe, as it is sometimes translated, a title almost as old as the corpus itself. That title is applied to Cyrus in the Ur-Brick inscription in line 1, and the Cyrus cylinder, line 20, and in the verse account of Nabonidus, column 5, line 4. Attestations in Babylonian and especially Assyrian texts of universality are legion, almost bewildering in their colorful variety. Esarhaddon ruled all the lands, or exercised his lordship over all the lands. Ashurbanipal is granted to extend land and his people. Marduk calls Nabopolassar to rule the land and the people. The list seems endless, at least it does to me right now. This is barely the tip of the iceberg, and while I have not yet found a precise match for the phrasing as it occurs in the Ur-Brick, frankly I assume that is because I haven't looked hard enough. Perhaps my colleagues might help set me straight on this, or on a straighter course here. One must also consider whether these differences in phrasing of title and epithet are simply a matter of elegant variation, perhaps scribal experimentation, or to what extent they hold ideological significance. And at any rate, with regard to the first part of my talk, I think we can safely say that now all of these lands, Anshan, Susa, Parsa, Parsumash, etc., are all part of this one land, now of Cyrus's. So finally, also granted, it is hazardous to make too much of one reference in one inscription, especially one written in Akkadian and then applied to a concept present, at least in the eyes of some scholars, within an Old Persian inventory. It also gives cause to reiterate that we are dealing with a corpus of 4 Babylonian inscriptions for Cyrus, 2 of them quite short. With the preceding caveats in mind, however, it seems appropriate that any discussion of the Achaemenids' one world ought to include some cautious acknowledgement of Cyrus for a possible nascent manifestation of this perspective. We learn more and more that Darius the first reformative genius, if I may call it that, had been anticipated, finding earlier expression. Perhaps that is the case here. If I may put it this way, Cyrus may yet again have been one step ahead of us. Thank you.
It's now my very great pleasure to introduce Professor David Stronach from the University of California, Berkeley. Professor Stronach started excavations at Pasargadae in the 1960s and published a monumental Oxford University Press volume on his work there. Since that time, he has done a large number of different studies of Cyrus, of Pasargadae, his capital, and the world of the Achaemenids. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce him as one of the founders of the field of study of ancient Iran, and in particular, the Achaemenids. Professor Stronach.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm most grateful to have been asked to take part in this notable conference, which would seem to me to represent one of the more significant outcomes of the peregrinations of the well-travelled Cyrus cylinder. As I look round this jam-packed room, I'd also like to say that a very considerable debt is owed to Professor Rahim Shayagan and to the program in Iranian Studies at UCLA for bringing together so many noted participants and still other interested parties as part of the present much anticipated event. As Matt Waters' paper has already indicated, one of the more important advances in Achaemenid studies in recent years has been the progress that has been made in tracking the effects of the Elamite-Persian acculturation. The gains that have been made in the philological field are especially noteworthy. Thus it is striking to note that, in the words of Rahim Shayagan, scribes who wrote the Persepolis fortification tablets were predominantly polyglot Iranian scribes for whom writing in Elamite may have been an ordinary extension of their linguistic and scribal capacities. Such an observation clearly underscores the vital role that this kind of acculturation must have played in shaping many fundamental aspects of the early Achaemenid world, a world that had its hub near the center of the modern province of Fars, which was easy to say approximately in this area. In archaeological and art historical terms, we've only begun, however, to explore the debt of Achaemenid art and design to earlier Elamite art and design. But instead of simply leaving you to digest this terse assertion, I thought, since I myself am somewhat involved in these areas of inquiry, that I would try to show you some examples of what may lie in store in this regard. A few years ago, in an article that came out in Iranica Antiqua in 2005, I drew attention to certain parallels that were to be found between the appearance and to some extent the pose of the late Elamite winged leonine creatures that appear on the flaring disc-like finials of the Argent gold ring. And the somewhat comparable griffins that adorn the top of the scabbard of a short sword that is depicted in one of the principal Achaemenid reliefs at Persepolis. The little plant that they both have their sort of forward paws on is sort of mirrors the earlier design, as you will have noticed. In this same article, I also took note of the fact that the celebrated ring from the intact tomb at Arjan was too small to be worn on either the upper arm or even on the wrist. Accordingly, in the tomb, it was placed in the grasp of and resting on the chest of its deceased owner, presumably as a symbol of the authority that this individual had once enjoyed. Then, when I was looking at the Cyrus cylinder exhibit the other day in its prior venue in San Francisco, I was suddenly struck by the fact that no object like the famous Oxus armlet was ever depicted as an adornment or an honorific on the person of anybody depicted in an Achaemenid relief. Such objects are shown, however, as being held in the hand, as in the case of these members, or one member of the Lydian delegation in the Apadana reliefs at Persepolis. As a result, it suddenly occurred to me that the Oxus armlet, with its magnificent winged griffin finials, could very well represent an Achaemenid version of the older, highly original Elamite emblem of power. And such objects may well have been received by the king and passed on to courtiers or prominent members of the court by the king in pairs, since we know of two examples from the Apadana relief and two examples from the famous Oxus treasure. This no more than tentative suggestion is brought to your attention to stress the extent to which elements of Elamite iconography were almost certainly adopted and, of course, adapted by Achaemenid designers. This said, I would very much wish to make the point that we should clearly be on our guard against ascribing the larger part of everything that we find in the Achaemenid Persian sphere to Elamite antecedents or influences. There's not time, I'm afraid, to go into the wide range of Iranian influences, or more explicitly, Median influences, that were also present in the highlands of southwest Iran during the course of the 6th century BC. But this is another never-to-be-forgotten element and a moment of dramatic change in this key area. At the moment, I would like to turn, in line with the main thrust of the present paper, to Professor Dan Potts' conviction that the various Anshon-related titles that are listed in the Cyrus cylinder each represent titles that were actually employed by Cyrus and prior members of his dynastic line. And here you see the familiar titles you can take a moment to read. As many of you in this room will be well aware, this same conviction recently led my good friend Dan Potts to make the rather startling suggestion in 2005 that Cyrus founded an Anshonite, not a Persian empire. And this is the main point I'm discussing in this paper. In Erling Finkel's new translation of the text of the cylinder, Cyrus declares himself to be the king of the city of Anshon at the point where his name is first mentioned, and with reference to his lineage, he relates that he is the son of Cambyses the great king, king of the city of Anshon, grandson of Cyrus the great king, king of the city of Anshon, descendant of Thespes the great king, king of the city of Anshon. To begin to look further at Potts' serious question of the previously generally accepted Persian identity of Cyrus, it may be useful to recall where the once major urban site of Anshon was located. Some 30 years after the discovery in the early 1970s that the extensive mounded areas of Tali-Marjan, I think you can see that on the slide, had to be associated with the long-sought city of Anshon, Potts came to endorse a view that this long-lived site, dating back to circa 3000 BC, could have formed the focus of the region in which Cyrus's predecessors lived, and where, as he suggests, in the 7th and early 6th centuries BC, they could have ruled over a quasi-independent kingdom that was, quote, culturally Elamite, not Persian. In this aerial photograph, which comes from a new book, Ancient Iran from the Air, edited and co-written by Ali Mousavi and myself, you can very clearly dissect the circuit of the huge, somewhat irregular perimeter wall that appears to have been used to defend the site, at least through most of the 3rd and the 2nd millennia BC, when the site was at the height of its fame. You can see the circuit here. To the objection that Malian appears to be more or less abandoned by a date near 850 BC, Potts has responded by pointing out that Tali-Marjan is a very large mound, only a small portion of which has been explored to date. Thus, there is every chance that a Neo-Elamite settlement is present somewhere on the site. The cogency of this reasoning is not to be denied, but at the same time, I think Elizabeth Carter, a senior member of the original Malian expedition, would agree with me that most of the mound was carefully examined, even if only a small portion of it was actually excavated, and that no traces of a Neo-Elamite settlement were encountered during close to a decade of intensive field work. Instead, the various excavations and surveys that were conducted in and near Tali-Marjan during the 1970s have combined to point towards an increasingly limited role for the long-occupied site of Anshon towards the end of the 2nd millennium. At that time, Anshon was apparently no longer a major upland Elamite co-capital, notwithstanding the Middle Elamite king's continued use of the ancient title King of Anshan and Susa. Instead, the site had become, as Carter has indicated, a culturally isolated centre in the highlands that was possibly involved in metal trading. Of still greater significance with reference to the current debate is the fact that Tolimal Yarn stands only 50 kilometres to the west-northwest of Persepolis. And as a result, it is decidedly difficult to see how such a locality, situated on a level plain in close proximity to the early historical core region of Fars, near Persepolis, could have remained a distinct ethnocultural enclave in the middle of an increasingly Persian environment. And I might just say that my own sort of notion is that the site of Istach, whenever it will come to be excavated, might prove to show where the Thespids really had their local centre in that area. With reference to other relevant evidence from pre-Achaemenid Fars, i.e. from the heart of the ancient province of Anshan, later known in whole or in part after the arrival of the Persians by such names as you've already heard as Parsamash or later Parsa, I would like to draw attention, and as some things will repeat here, to Mark Garrison's recent wide-ranging study of a spectacular heirloom seal. Certain of Garrison's latest interpretations of this seal could indicate, it seems to me, that the local rulers of eastern highlands of southwestern Iran sought to redefine the meaning of the term Anshan as a local Persian label, rather than as an enduring label with solely Elamite connotations during, say, the late 7th and the early 6th centuries BC. While the seal itself is only attested through impressions that occur on numerous tablets in the Persepolis Fortification Archive, the details of the original design are not in doubt. And since the image includes a 6-line inscription written in Elamite that can be read as Kurash the Anshanite son of Thespes, this exceptional object cannot be excluded from the present discussion. And as again you've heard, it probably refers to Cyrus' grandfather, Cyrus I, and quite possibly to his grandfather, Thespes, as well, great-grandfather. According to Garrison, the seal in question may have represented not only an indigenous product of the eastern highlands of southwestern Iran, but, quote, the remnants of a nascent court style associated with a Thespid royal house. He goes on to say that the scene in the seal illustrates an exceptional use of space that is otherwise attested in similar spatial arrangements in bas-reliefs of Ashurbanipal from the Southwest Palace and the North Palace at Nineveh. All of this strikes me as unusually interesting in that it seems to provide an earlier local precedent for Cyrus the Great's subsequent references to later Assyrian sculpture, and especially motifs used by Ashurbanipal at his capital, Pasargadae. More than this, we find that the model for the Thespids' growing aspirations did not lie in the direction of characteristic forms of Elamite expression. Rather, they seem to have lain in the direction of certain innovative aspects of late Assyrian imagery. It's even possible, as Matt Waters suggested a few years ago, that the mounted horseman in the present image, conceivably Kurash himself, is shown defeating a group of Elamites insofar as a broken bow, the item which you see here, is a known Elamite symbol of submission. As to the various reasons why the name of Anshan should have appealed so strongly to the early Thespids in the second half of the 7th century, I doubt we shall ever be aware of more than a few incomplete answers. But apart from anything else, it's worth remembering that, at this date, there was probably not the same highly developed sense of the special worth of a Persian identity that so obviously obtained during the later reign of Darius the Great. Accordingly, it is perhaps not too surprising that there should have been a lively interest in this ancient epic name, which had once been synonymous with extended regional control over much of southwestern Iran. Indeed, in the face of continuing lowland Elamite claims to the throne of Anshan and Susa, even down to Kirka 600 BC and perhaps later, there could have been a local determination to appropriate an Anshanite identity as one way of stressing that the region that had long been known as Anshan was nothing less than the inalienable, well-favoured highland home of the now firmly established Tesfid dynasty. Whether or not early articulations of this kind would have been enough to give Cyrus a strong sense of an Anshanite identity for himself and his forebears, particularly at the end of the 540s, when at least half of the known world was already in his possession, is very much an open question. And since this is the case, I would like to turn to a very different hypothesis to that advanced by Professor Potts. For many years, I'd always assumed that the Anshan-related titles in the Cyrus cylinder did not tell us so much about the precise history of Cyrus' ancestral line as they acquainted us with certain ideological and political sensitivities that Cyrus expected to encounter at the moment that he sought to consolidate his hold on his last major acquisition, the city of Babylon. Apart from appealing to broad grounds of probability to support this argument, I was at a loss to know, however, how to give more direct impact to this particular view. Then two intriguing developments occurred. Published a new translation of the text of the cylinder, and secondly, Antigone Zulnazi, a gifted former student of mine, raised a whole range of fresh considerations based in part on certain aspects of Finkel's new translation, which chose to translate the determinative for city that appears in each instance where the name of Anshan appears in the text of the cylinder. Right away, I have to say that not a few of the distinguished cuneiformists in this audience may be puzzled by Dr. Finkel's decision to translate the determinative for city wherever it occurs in the text. The matter is complicated in that the Sumerogram for city, Uru, can be used as a determinative, in which case it is not usually pronounced or translated, but at the same time it can also be meant to be pronounced. The same is also true for the Sumerogram for land, Kur. As Professor Walters has also vouchsafed to me, the correct use of these two separate determinatives was not always carefully respected in late Babylonian cuneiform. Accordingly, we have many possible variables to contend with. I might add that I had an opportunity to speak to Dr. Finkel about this matter when a number of us in this room were attending yesterday's agreeable occasion at the Getty Villa, and he explained that he had wanted to create as complete and as clear a translation as possible, and that this alone had governed his decision to translate the determinative for city. This is quite interesting because in his recent publications about the cylinder and its translation, he nowhere makes this point. But as some of you will know, the latest translation was then taken by Shah Rukh Rasul and translated into Persian, and he wanted to give Shah Rukh as clear as possible a basic text from which to work. So this has opened up these new vistas to my mind. However all this may be, the consistent manner in which the determinative for city is employed wherever Anshan is mentioned in the Cyrus cylinder is quite notable. So if we may for the moment explore the situation in the light of this new reading, I will turn to Antigone Zulnazi's main arguments, which can be found pre-published on Achaemenet, as well as separately summarized in a paper of my own that will very shortly appear in the journal Iran. She observes in particular that concrete references to a royal connection of Cyrus's family with Anshan are so far only available in texts written in Babylonian, and that beyond the testimony of the text in question, quote, there is no incontrovertible evidence to suggest that any of Cyrus's ancestors viewed themselves as Anshanite monarchs, or that any of them ruled from the city of Anshan. Suriname next points to the remarkable extent to which the early Achaemenid rulers, such as Cyrus and Darius, were willing to legitimate their rule in different political and cultural circumstances by adapting the official image of Persian royalty to different local norms of legitimate kingship. In this context, she especially references the Egyptian formulations of royal authority associated with Darius I in the hieroglyphic texts that occur on the statue of Darius. This statue was made in Egypt before it was later transported to Susa by Darius' son and heir Xerxes to stand near the gate of Darius at that great site. Let's just read the text because it makes what Antigone is referring to very clear. The perfect God, master of the two lands, king of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, Darius. Life, prosperity, and health. Image made as an exact remembrance of the perfect God. He is in fact clad in the court dress that we know so well from Persepolis. Master of the two lands, which his majesty had made so that a monument of himself might be permanently established, and this person will be remembered with his father Amun for the length of eternity. Zuinati goes on to propose that this same imperative could explain references to Cyrus as a king of the city of Anshan in a specifically Mesopotamian setting, especially in a text that was meant to portray Cyrus to a quite considerable extent as a stereotypical Mesopotamian monarch. Among other related remarks, Zuinati argues that the Cyrus Cylinder's association of Cyrus and his forebears with Anshan ought not to be perceived as a marker of a less than fully Persian ideological and or ethno-cultural identity for Cyrus and his line. In support of this claim, she appeals, not least, to the role that the venerable Sumerian king list continued to play, even in the Neo-Babylonian, relatively late Neo-Babylonian period, in fortifying a Mesopotamian worldview that there was only a single divinely sanctioned and hence legitimate line of kingship, and that the right to rule was above all the prerogative of cities. With reference to the difficulty of finding an urban location in Fars that could meet Mesopotamian expectations in this context, at least prior to the completion of construction work at Pasargadae, where important building projects still remained unfinished at the time of Cyrus' death in 530 BC. Zuinati suggests that it may have seemed only logical to invoke the name of Anshan, a city of long renown in the annals of Mesopotamian history, as the formal seat of Cyrus' dynastic line. As she also observes, this solution may have appeared at the time of Cyrus' accession to the throne of Babylon in 539 BC, as the best available means of fulfilling the aforementioned right to rule, and most particularly as the best means of legitimating Cyrus' place in the native Mesopotamian continuum of kingship. I might add that from an Iranian perspective, the kingship was probably seen to have moved in concert with unfolding political events from Nineveh, the last Assyrian capital, to Hamadan, the Median capital, and so to the Persian homeland in Fars. I would like to go on to say that even for those of you who may think that Zuinati's arguments build too heavily on the aforementioned presence of the determinants of a city, there are not a few reasons for thinking that Cyrus' use of Anshan-related titles was very possibly closely connected to the contemporary Babylonian mindset. There are grounds for thinking, for example, that Nabonidus, whom Cyrus removed from the throne of Babylon, could have a little earlier referred to Cyrus as the king of Anshan, albeit using the determinative for land, not city. And in general terms, the Babylonians may be said to have had a certain affinity for the use of archaic, or at least no longer strictly contemporary terms for foreign lands and peoples. This statement applies to the use that is made in various documents of about this time of such terms as Urartu, the Guti, and the Umanmanda. In short, Cyrus's use of the name of Anshan could also be seen to fit these circumstances. One other considerable problem that stands in the way of trying to assess the significance of the Anshan-related titles that Cyrus ascribes to himself and his ancestors in the cylinder is that they cannot be compared to indisputable royal title that Cyrus, or any of his predecessors, is known to have used in Iran. Accordingly, the only other titles of Cyrus available for comparison come from two separate inscriptions that are known from southern Mesopotamia. I apologize for a certain overlap with Matt's presentation. The first inscription, which occurs on stamped bricks from Ur, follows a good part of the already familiar formula in the Cyrus cylinder, except that the word Anshan is preceded by the determinative for land rather than city. The text reads, Cyrus, king of the world, king of Anshan, son of Cambyses, king of Anshan. The great gods delivered all the lands into my hands, when I made this land to dwell in peace. In a still greater departure from the relevant titles in the Cyrus cylinder, the second inscription, one that is known from inscribed bricks from Uruk, omits any mention of Anshan. Thus it reads, Cyrus, king of lands, beloved of Esagil and Azida, the main temples of Babylon and Borsippa respectively. Son of Cambyses, the mighty king am I. While it would be hazardous to attempt to draw any very broad conclusions from such limited additional evidence, it deserves to be noted that Cyrus' son and successor Cambyses II was left only a very limited record of any titles associated with his reign, is not known to have used any title that continued to invoke the name of Anshan. Furthermore, he is identified by Darius in the Babylonian version of Darius' great trilingual inscription at Sisatun as king of Persia, king of lands. The Babylonian version, by the way, was carved on the protruding portion of the Sisatun rock just here. It's quite difficult to get up here, and I remember I went up with a ladder. I wanted to see if two chisel marks, an important chronological clue, were present anywhere in the relief here. I did this with my friend Carl Nielander, and I have to say we took a very good look at the feet, because you have to put the ladder up in such a way that it's not too close to this and it's not too steep that you'll fall backwards. But it wasn't a very successful experiment. Maybe someone will make a better effort in the future. But I don't think there were any tooth chisel marks on it, so that was an interesting chronological episode, because we know this was carved in about 519 BC. As a result of all these considerations, there would seem to be a distinct possibility that the elaborate Anshan-related titles that are recorded in the Cyrus cylinder only remained in currency for a distinctly short time. Indeed, it would seem to be more than likely that these same resounding titles would surely represent examples of titular exaggeration in the case of Cyrus's three named forebears, were explicitly designed to provide carefully crafted, no more than briefly needed testimony that served to fortify the legitimacy of Cyrus's very earliest period of rule in Babylon. As documents that were strictly designed to serve this all too understandable purpose, as Cyrus sought to consolidate his control over his last and greatest conquest, I see no reason, no very compelling reason, why such titles should be viewed as a major challenge to Cyrus's Persian identity. Finally, since Cyrus is an individual to whom we cannot even ascribe a more than very approximate image in our minds, I want to add one small postscript to this talk. When more than a year ago Mr. Bahram Zarin Afsar approached me for advice on how Cyrus could be represented in visual terms in connection with a statue of Cyrus that he was hoping to create, he is both a sculptor and architect, I found myself intrigued. I've since been searching for images such as the one now on the screen that might reasonably be used to advance this project. I think the figure here is quite close to the figure of Darius in some ways on the Bistun relief, and so it may date from either the late, or from, say, the late 530s to the late 520s BC. And it represents a Persian royal hero, and of course we know the Persian royal hero was almost always given very much the same appearance as the contemporary Persian king. But it's not an easy task, as probably many of you will appreciate. But I understand the project is advancing, and I thought you might like to know that Mr. Zarin Afsar, who lives here in Southern California, is hopeful that the statue can be unveiled early in 2014. I personally very much hope this will be the case, and I promise to keep Professor Shayagan and other close colleagues in this vicinity appraised of this project's future progress. Thank you very much.
We have time for a few questions, and if both of our speakers will take their places. Yes.
I would like to pose a question regarding the religion of the great. Here, the panel telling me whether Cyrus the Great had any religion, and whether among the religion at his time, Zoroastrianism, number one, Judaism, number two, and the oldest, the Mithraism, had any influence on Cyrus the Great. I would be very much impressed if I hear a summary concisely telling me what the panel thinks. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll try and answer just like this, and you'll get support from it at the moment. Of course, it's a very good question, as you know, and of course I don't have a very exact answer for it, as you also already know, Mr. Rastiga. But anyway, it's a subject which has long interested me, as you might well imagine, and I can tell you one little story that might amuse at least a bit. When I was studying the tomb of Cyrus in great detail, I was one time up on the roof of the tomb of Cyrus. Two of my architects were in the hollow sort of gable chamber that was above the tomb itself. And it was rather a windy day, and I don't have a very good head for heights. And so I thought it would be an awfully good idea to lie down and see if I could see something useful from a recumbent posture. And so I found it was possible to lie on the flat ridge of the top of the tomb. The extreme top of the tomb is missing, so that made it possible for me to do this. And then I wanted to look at the mouldings over the door from a new view, i.e. from above. Thank you. And so I was amazed to find, as I, perhaps I should put this on, let's behave. I was amazed to find that my view was blocked by something that was protruding from the surface of the stone. So I put my hand rather gingerly over the front of the tomb, and then I could feel the petals of a rosette. And I was thrilled, and of course when I got down by ladders and things to the ground, And then I knew what to look for. I could see the rosette that I had never spotted in all those years at the site. And I was so excited that I raced in my Land Rover to Shiraz to tell Professor Richard Fry and had to come out and look at it. I wanted a colleague to confirm that I wasn't dreaming. And so Richard came out and climbed our rickety ladder, and I had to hold the bottom for him. And I had the great satisfaction of hearing him say, "My God," he didn't believe me, "there is something here," which was very satisfactory. But I don't think, unfortunately, though some people have used that rosette to suggest that it might be associated with Mithra, and that Cyrus followed particularly a worship of Mithra. I think myself, you can't really find a religious identity for that symbol. It's unlike any other rosette we have, but it could just be a decorative, in a very restrained monument, one decorative motif, which was a sort of carved-like feature at the end of the ridgepole in a wooden prototype. And who knows, it might have been covered with gold leaf or something, and it looked very spectacular. But to come to the question in general terms, I actually, unlike some people, believe that there are more direct connections between the reigns of Cyrus and Darius than is always supposed. And I think one of these connections is in the religious sphere. And the reason I say this is that when I was excavating at Pasargadae, I found a number of fire holders or fire altars which were made of very fine stone without the tooth chisel, so I associate them most probably with the reign of Cyrus. And they have this stepped outline, which we know from Naqsh Rustam, for example, where Darius stands opposite a stepped altar. And so I think that there are connections between the religion of Cyrus and the subsequent religion of Darius, who certainly considered Ahura Mazda to be his main god. So I think it's technology sort of assails me wherever I go. I think it's probable that as we now generally regard Darius and his successors as Mazda-worshipping individuals, that Cyrus was also a Mazda-worshipping individual, not necessarily a Zoroastrian, but something very close to that. And I have to leave that question there. I hope that's helpful.
Yes.
Yes, my question is for Professor Watt. We used to think that Darius and Cyrus were both Achaemenids. Now, the fashion is to say neither of them is Achaemenid because Achaemenids didn't exist. Part of that controversy has been buttressed by your translation of DDL, because the theory now is Darius who has sort of invented the Old Persian script, or was the first to use it. And once you take that as a hypothesis, the inscription in Pasargadae that Cyrus says, "I'm an Achaemenid," then doesn't hold. It's not his work, because Darius was the first to write the Old Persian script. So we must find who wrote this. The theory is Darius wrote this. Why? Because he was in want of legitimacy, and we go back to Bisotun, and we think that the story he gives about his ascension to the throne is sort of a lie, incorrect, and therefore Darius is a liar. Now, if I look at Bisotun, between that story being a lie and the boast that Darius invented or was the first to use that script, this second one seems to be a bigger lie, because the soldier coming from Egypt, in a matter of 1 year, having himself invented the script, or having somebody invent a script, seems to me far-fetched. So it seems to be a little bit of a Kafkaesque reasoning to say, okay, we accept the boast that Darius invented the script as correct, but we say that what he says about his ascension to the throne is incorrect. If he's a liar here and there. You can't pick and choose. Now, Francois Ballard has...
We should let him respond.
No, because the main question is here, I'm sorry. Francois Ballard has rebutted this, has made a rebuttal of this, and I want to know, because he has given 2 points that nobody is referring to. One is exactly what that sentence meant, and the second is a determinative in the Elamite version of Pasargadae inscriptions that only appears in the early Neo-Elamite versions, inscriptions, and never in Darius's inscription. So I want your take on that.
Well, welcome to the wonderfully convoluted world of Canada historiography. Right? I know, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, I'm kind of afraid of these microphones now. All right, first of all, some of those assertions are certainly not, I mean, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants on many of these aspects. I mean, with regard to the creation of the old Persian script, for example. It is, if I understand your point correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, that there can be some inconsistency in looking at Darius' story, if you will, about how he attained the throne with the false Gamada and the rest of the liar kings, as filled with exaggerations or infelicities itself, and then on the other hand, take his claim for the creation of the script to be genuine. Yes, that's basically the dichotomy you're mentioning. I'll leave the first aside. For the second, both archaeologically from David Stronach's evidence and from the corpus, which is admittedly problematic, those inscriptions from Ariadnes and Arsames, I fall into line, if you will, with many who think that those are either forgeries or were written later.
Why?
So there is no, what's that?
Why?
Why?
Yes, why? Did you give a reason?
Why do I fall into that line?
No,
Or what?
why do you think they're forgeries?
Well, in the sense that the two from Hamadan are filled with, a standard line, which I follow, is a filled with grammatical, say, peculiarities. They're not from a secure context. And that there are enough questions associated with them. And that there isn't any independent evidence that I consider reliable. This is interpreted, of course, and I'm following a tradition, if you will, that material, there isn't any independent evidence that we can firmly date, let me rephrase it, there isn't any independent evidence for any inscriptions that might be datable before Darius in Old Persian to be genuine. As far as the orthography of the Pasargadae inscriptions, which I also hold, as with many others, Darius put there are differences even between CMA and CMC. And with regard to the determinative, and I don't want to be too glib here, but from my rather painful studies in Neo-Elamite, I mean, I refer to Bala and many things here, but I found very little consistency in the application of determinatives there as well. And so, if you use, for example, the Urbrick, we talked about both David and I in the course of our discussions, that is written in archaizing the script. The Cyrus agents, whoever decided to do this, following wonderful Neo-Babylonian tradition, chose to represent this as in this age-old script. I have absolutely no idea, I don't know that anybody does, as to what sort of motivations, what sort of orthographical principles, if you will, may have been applied by Darius or his agents in inscribing those inscriptions, CMA and CMC, at Pasargadae. One of them, and I apologize if I conflate this, I think the CMC has the Ra determined, or not, excuse me, the Ra delocutive ending. The other one does not, CMA. So there's inconsistencies even within those. I mean, this is why there's so many different interpretations. It's extremely difficult to...
May I just add one point? I think it's highly irresponsible to declare an item, a rare document from antiquity, as forgery when you don't have enough proof. I think you have to apply the other way around, because you're eliminating an important document without ever looking at the actual item, without having strong arguments. And the argument that there are inconsistencies there and these inconsistencies only appear later on is completely wrong. Both Reverend Sharp, Bala, and also the Proport saying that there are that kind of inconsistencies in earlier inscriptions as well.
That may be, my response to that is simply, I have not gone, at least not in the past few years, I'm going to revisit these particular inscriptions because I've been totally satisfied with even Kent's, I mean, some of the other earlier studies on these have proclaimed them such. So I didn't feel a personal need to revisit that issue. I mean, obviously others feel differently.
Yes.
Yes, talking about religion, because it's always asked, religion of Cyrus and Nairobi, whether he worshipped, Cyrus worshipped, Marduk or Darius worshipped, Ahura Mazda, always through my reading, realized religion is the way of going through the politics, because they were warriors, they were leaders. That was the main point of their life, than religion. I might be wrong, I want to question, because when I read history, you go from all the way to Sasanian, you don't see the main influence of religion in the politics. Before that, religion is a tool for their politics and their rule in other countries. It's not as much as Holy Roman Empire that the religion ruled. It's the other way, it's the politics that they use that as a tool. You cannot pinpoint. Even as Darius using Ahura Mazda. If I get my answer, please.
If I may ask a question to the audience, if I may ask you to please ask questions directly pertinent to the papers that have been presented, rather than questions that might be outside of the realm of the papers, because some of the issues that are being raised here would be addressed later on. And I think it would be maybe more agreeable to the presenters and speakers to have questions more appropriate to their own presentations. But obviously,
I want to make sure I said, your question or comments focusing on the religion, the emphasis with regard to Ahura Mazda, is that short?
It's the politics that played the role.
How do you disassociate the two? Is that
Because they try going to Babel and worshiping in the Zealander is always talking about the Marduk. I don't believe you are a believer of Marduk.
No, that's because it's a Babylonian
Yes.
context.
So
That's exactly right.
religion is a tool for their politics.
I'm sorry, what was the last part?
The tool that they can use for their leadership and politics.
Sure, of course. I mean, that is part of the genius, I think, is to be able to incorporate or adopt and adapt into these various traditions. I think that's part of the whole wonderful package. Again, with regard to the Persian, Cyrus's genius, Persian genius.
Sure.
How else were they so successful? That's the condensed short version. Yes, I think that's definitely.
Thank you.
Why does there appear to be so little evidence of the Ottoman and Persian Empire? By that I mean inscriptions and other historical data for an empire that was so great, covered so much land, there was so much control, taxation, all the trade, all the different things that were happening. As opposed to, let's say, the Assyrian Empire, the Assyrians, which is a much smaller empire, we know the history, we know a lot of detail, and we have very, very little detail. And in fact, I'm amazed at the fact that you have the statue of Darius, this is the main artifact being made in Egypt and shipped back with War of the Two Lands, the god Amun. I mean, can't they do their own? Why isn't there evidence in Persia of the existence and the importance of the Persian Empire? Why is there so little of it? Archaeologically and epigraphically.
We haven't found it on David.
No, it's a very good question, but very difficult to answer.
Is there an idea where it might be? Okay.
I think one of our problems is that we might be comparing the texts
years ago. It's been out there. I don't know that it's never been really successfully rebutted, if you will. I don't have the linguistic background going into the earlier periods to be able to. I looked at the material some time ago, but I don't have any. I wish I had light to shed on that. I have no professional opinion.
You mentioned the linguistic a little bit, but it was kind of absent.
I'm sorry?
You mentioned the linguistic association between Shuchuan and another term that I escaped.
That wasn't meant to be linguistic. That was that is meant to be highly abstract, if you will, a presentation of how the terms and the labels, regardless of which language they're from more than one, Elamite or Akkadian in particular, changed in the Old Persian over time. I mean, this is the problem with labels, titles. It's extremely convoluted. That wasn't meant to be a linguistic.
One last question. Anybody? I thought I saw someone. In that case, I'd like to, yes.
Professor, thanks for the presentation. Could you please enlighten us as to the geographical boundary of the kingdom of Anshan? And in today's terms, what is the name of that locale, the city of Anshan?
Professor Hertzfeld, many years ago, suggested that the province of Anshan, because of course you have the capital city called Anshan and the province around it, could be perhaps coterminous with the area.
I'm a little hard of hearing.
Of Fars. If I understood you, you were asking about the location of the province of Anshan, or the margins of Anshan. Was that correct? The area covered by Anshan. Well, Professor Potts has written a whole article about that, to say it's very difficult to define, and I thought that was very well put, and I think I'm going to protect myself behind that. But by and large, I think of the area of modern Fars as containing most of what the ancients probably regarded as Anshan.
And the present locale of that city of Anshan?
Well, as I say, we know exactly where that is now, because there was inscribed evidence found on the surface of Ptolemaion, and that settled that long puzzling issue. On one of the maps that I showed, you could see the site of Boros Jan near the Persian Gulf. And of course, if Anshan had been down there in a totally different venue from Persepolis, we might be sort of faced with a very different story, but we're not. We know it existed 50 kilometers from Persepolis, and that really sort of affects many, many issues, and I think I should leave it at that.
And the alien photograph you showed, was that one of the city of Anshan?
That is, yes, absolutely, yes. It was taken by Dr. Gerster in a collection of photographs that he made. He's a wonderful aerial photographer. In the late 1970s, or between 76 and 78. And originally Bill Sumner, the director of the Oriental Institute, was going to use these photographs to put together a book with the assistance of others, and I was one of them. And then when Bill Sumner fell ill, he asked me to take the project over, and although it was difficult because I had to finish other books and things, it did at last come out in 2012, and it's a very wonderful collection of air photographs of Iran.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's thank our speakers.
In front. So this is not a strong argument either. The scribes of Cyrus could have just adopted the titles from Nabonidus directly. Since the cylinder explains why Cyrus had to replace his, until then, legitimate predecessor, the text belongs to the genre of apologies. There are similar apologies in the ancient Near East, and their main argument is that the former king either never had or, in the meantime, had lost divine support. For example, Nabonidus himself once explained in this way why Labash Marutuk, the legitimate son and successor of King Neriglissar, had to be removed from the throne. According to Nabonidus, Labash Marutuk sat on the throne, quote, against the will of the gods, and furthermore, he displayed a bad character and, quote, would not show proper behavior, whatever this means. Very close to the arguments of the Cyrus cylinder is a text of the Assyrian king Sargon II, which explains why his brother and predecessor lost the throne. Shalmaneser V, dubbed in the text, he who did not fear the king of the universe, that is Ashur, had imposed corvée labor on the citizens of the holy city of Ashur. In consequence, quote, the enlil of the gods, Ashur again, overthrew his reign in the ways of his heart and appointed Sargon instead. In the ancient Near East, many holy cities like Ashur, Nippur or Babylon enjoyed privileges such as freedom from taxation and from service to the king, since they were entirely to serve their tutelar deities. So at the bottom line of the grievous sin of Shalmaneser, there is just the accusation of having imposed taxes. Also the sins of Nabonidus fit into this scheme. According to the cylinder, his main fault consisted in the fact that he did not fear Marduk, the king of the gods, anymore. The reverence for Marduk he brought to an end in his heart. This is the reason why he lays his hand on Babylon with evil intent. He made a copy, a counterfeit of Ezangil, the main temple of Marduk and the center of the universe. This accusation aims at the fact that Nabonidus indeed fostered the cult of the Syrian moon god of Haran as king of the gods, and that he restored his temple there at Haran. Furthermore, Nabonidus is said to have introduced inappropriate cultic practices and to have cut the offerings. And last but not least, he oppressed the good people of Babylon, quote, he ruined them by a yoke without relief. Obviously, like Shalmaneser, Nabonidus had imposed taxes on the rich temples and cities of Babylonia. This was a bad mistake, and Marduk went into action. Just as Marduk once had saved the gods, his fathers, from hardship in days of old, he now saved his city Babylon from the hardship imposed by Nabonidus. The rare phrase used in the Cyrus cylinder, Iterina Shapshak, is a clear allusion to a verse from the Babylonian epic of creation, Enuma Elish, which is dedicated to Marduk as king of the universe. There is also another quote from Enuma Elish in the phrase ordering Cyrus and Cambyses to execute the office of the provider for the temples of the gods of Babylonia. Quote, may they be now the provisioners of our shrines. And there are more allusions to Enuma Elish. The Cyrus cylinder states that Marduk saw with joy the good deeds and the righteous heart of Cyrus. According to the cylinder, it was even Marduk himself who had created and bestowed that white heart on the king as his destiny. This motive harkens back to earlier examples. Also Nabopolassar, who, like Cyrus, came to the Babylonian throne very much as a usurper, with no hereditary claim to the throne, stressed the qualities of his good character instead. Quote, Shazu, that is Marduk, the Lord who knows the heart of or among the gods of all heaven and earth, who constantly watches the innermost of the people, observed my thoughts, literally, that which is in my heart, and placed me into the most exalted position. All this talking, all this emphasis on the good heart of Babylonian kings is rooted in a very particular capacity of Marduk, which becomes manifest in one of his holy Sumerian names. In Enuma Elish, Marduk's 18th name is, quote, Shazu, that is, he who knoweth the mind or the heart, he who checks the mind. It is Marduk who has the power to observe and to check the thoughts of the heart of gods and men. The righteous and wide heart of Cyrus is a motive created by Babylonian scholars on the basis of this Shazu theology. Also, the main other topics of the Cyrus cylinder can be derived from further explanations of Marduk's holy names in Enuma Elish. Further variants of the name Shazu, that is Shazu Zizi, Shazu Zuhrim, Shazu Zachrim, etc., qualify Marduk as, quote, the one who punishes the evildoer, the one who subjugates the disobedient, the one who uproots his enemies and who thwarts their plans. And finally, Marduk is also the one who restores the gods who have left their shrines to their proper places. These two last topics, the removal of the disobedient ruler and the restoration of the gods to their temples, are the main themes of the Cyrus cylinder. Before the eyes of a faithful Babylonian who believed in Marduk, the power and meaning of his holy name Shazu came true in the fall of Nabonidus. The punishment of Nabonidus follows a scheme set up by another text from the circles of the priests of Marduk. That is the so-called Ezangil Chronicle. It wants to teach Babylonian kings the proper behavior towards Marduk and Babylon. The text apparently builds on material from the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium, but in the way it has come down to us, it is clearly a work of the early Neo-Babylonian period. The main topic of the chronicle is the status of the god Marduk. The reader is informed that, supplanting Enlil, Marduk has risen to the head of the pantheon. Marduk is not to be ignored or even opposed. This is the rather simple and straightforward moral which the author wants us to learn. To strengthen his point, the author gives a short summary of the history of earlier kings of Babylonia and how they fared. The kings and their deeds are shortly introduced and assessed. The sole line of argument runs along the question as to whether they had either heeded Marduk or not. Good kings get a good life and rule the world, bad kings are deposed or killed. Obviously, there are more bad kings than good kings, and so the narrative culminates in the final disaster of Ibizin, Shachlukti Ibizin, when Marduk wrathfully repudiated Babylonia and had it sacked by the barbarian hordes from the east, the Guti and the Umanmanda. The text shows that any offence committed would be punished by Marduk harshly but justly. No evildoer would escape from him. Sometimes bad kings are simply deposed from office. Sometimes they have to face illness or barbarians' hordes of invading. At the very end of the story, we see Marduk losing his temper. As the kings would not learn, death penalties increase, and finally disaster strikes during the reign of the hapless king Ibizin of Ur. This is when the gods left their shrines, went into exile to Elam, and delivered the land to destruction. Among the sins of the kings, there are two large groups. The one is offending the holy city of Babylon or its people. The other group consists of various offences against the food offerings that were to be served to Marduk. The individual examples are dominated by mirror elements, by mirror reward and mirror punishment. Sometimes these mirror elements display a highly philological character. That means the correspondence is in particular expressions or verbs that describe the action or events. For example, when the Guteans took away, Ekemo in Akkadian, the fish that was to be served to Marduk, Marduk in turn took away, Ekemo again, their rule. Sometimes the correspondence is more illustrative. So when Shulgi defiled and sullied the holy purification rites of Marduk, his body was sullied with leprosy in turn. And kings who would dare to oppress the people of Babylon would be punished with the element people or masses, that is, with barbarian enemy hordes sent against them by Marduk. Such is the punishment of Enmerkar of Uruk and Naranzin of Agade. Quote, Enmerkar, king of Uruk, wrecked the people, and so he, Marduk, summoned up against him the Umanmanda, who was, literally, the son of a bitch. Yeah, apicality. These phrases are repeated nearly verbally in the description of the sin and the punishment of Naram-Sin of Agade. Quote, Naram-Sin wrecked the people of Babylon, and so he, Marduk, summoned against him the horde of the Gutians, for a second time. In the story of Naram-Sin, we can see another feature of Marduk's perfect verdicts. The punishment may happen again for a second time in correspondence to the crime. When Naram-Sin offended the people of Babylon, Marduk sent barbarian hordes against him for a second time, literally, after Marduk had done so already with Enmerkar, who in like manner had offended the people. And the expression in correspondence in Akkadian Michred is even verbally employed in the story about Utuchengal. As an expression of perfect divine justice, the punishments have a strong measure-for-measure character. The mirror principle we see working in this chronicle is a kind of divine talion. As an expression of that divine law code, these punishments would occur regularly again. The same offense would call for the same punishment. For the Babylonian audience of that chronicle, learning from history meant applying the rule learned from these examples of kings of old to contemporaneous events. Now it is time to turn to Nabonidus and his fate again. According to the scholars or priests of Marduk, he had committed sins over sins. In fact, he is the sum of the sins of his predecessors. Among those sins, he had committed the sin of Sargon of Akkad, when he restored the temple of the moon god of Haran and decorated it excessively and unduly, creating a copy, a counterfeit of the true center of the world, Babylon. As to Sargon, the Sandal Chronicle and other texts have it that Sargon of Akkad built a likeness, a copy, a counterpart of Babylon next to Akkad. Nabonidus also committed the sin of Shulgi, that is, he did not keep the divine rites in order, but changed them and introduced improper cults. He committed the sin of Urzababa and Amaswena, that is, he cut the offerings and brought them to an halt. He committed the sin of Utuchengal, that is, he laid his hands on Babylon with evil intent. And, this is most important and comes last in the Cyrus cylinder as his most grievous sin, he committed the sins of Enmerkar and Naram-Sin, that is, he oppressed and wrecked the people of Babylon. And it is verbally, quote, at their complaints, at the complaints of the people, Nishu, that Marduk went into action. That is why he summoned the Guti and the Umanmanda as a punishment against Nabonidus, just as he had done twice before in the cases of Enmerkar and Naram-Sin. And now I come, to the topic Anshan, as my last slide. So when Cyrus, king of Anshan, crossed the Tigris with the troops of the Gutians and the Umanmanda, which meant the Medes in those days, this meant absolute terror for the Babylonians. At the end of the third millennium, Anshan and Elam had wiped out the empire of the famous third dynasty of Ur. This disaster was still part of the cultural memory of the Babylonians down in the first millennium. At the end of the second millennium, Shutruk-Nachunte and his son Kutir-Nachunte, by their titles Kings of Anshan and Shushan, had wiped out the Kassite dynasty. Assisted by the Umanmanda, they had devastated Babylonian cities and temples. And with Cyrus, another king of Anshan, was marching with the barbarian hordes of the Gutians and the Umanmanda towards Babylonia for a third time. This could only mean complete and utter destruction. In order to feel the surprise that must have struck the Babylonians when Anshan, Guti, Umanmanda entered Babylon peacefully and paid their homage to Marduk and Izangil, we should translate these elements into a tale about the king of the Huns, leading Gog and Magog against Rome and turning all of a sudden into a woolly lamb only at the gates of St. Peter. The taking of Babylon by Cyrus was a remarkable event in its own right, but it turned into a miracle wrought by Marduk when the Babylonians presented their reading of history on the basis of their sacred texts Enuma Elish for the heart of Cyrus and on the Assemble Chronicle for the punishment of Nabonidus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schaudig. We will now continue with the second speaker, Professor Beate Bongerad-Leisten, who is Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. She studied at the University of Tübingen and Harvard, where she studied Assyriology, Egyptology, and Ancient Near East. And her interests lie in the political, the intellectual, and the religious history of the ancient Near East. She's a prolific writer, but her current project is a book about the cosmology and kingship in ancient Assyria. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you, Jaco, for the kind introduction, and also thanks to the organizers who invited me to this exciting event. And thank you to all of you for being here. In June 24th, 1963, at the height of the Cold War, John F. Kennedy stood on a platform facing the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of Soviet oppression and the world's division into East and West, and delivered a speech that captivated the world. During his speech, Kennedy uttered the immortal lines, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum, I am a Roman citizen. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, ich bin ein Berliner, I'm a citizen of Berlin. With these words, Kennedy embraced the faith of the citizens of Berlin and boosted the morale of a people living in a city surrounded by barbed wire, an exclave situated deep within the Eastern Bloc. He not only cemented the view that the city was irrevocably part of the free Western world, but also embraced the identity of a city that once served as the cultural and political capital of a nation. In evoking both their past and their current political situation, Kennedy won the hearts of the people of Berlin and of the world. Women and men who witnessed this speech still remember it as the most incisive statement of the period after World War II. Kennedy's strategic boosting of the identity of the citizenry of Berlin can be located in a long tradition of superpowers and conquerors deliberately seeking the support of people who once had been enemies and had been defeated. This example from modern politics will serve as a model for my investigation of Cyrus' carefully drafted rhetoric in the so-called Cyrus Cylinder, which was created to commemorate the restoration of the city walls of Babylon after his conquest of Babylon. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, had managed to bring former Median territory under his control, including Fars in southern Iran, parts of Central Asia to the east, and westwards far into Anatolian territory, including the Lydian kingdom. In 539, he added the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which included the entire Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Egyptian frontier. The empire created by Cyrus was the largest the world had yet seen and had no rivals for most of its duration. Adding Babylonia to his dominion, Cyrus not only considerably enlarged his territory and augmented his economic resources, but also inherited a cultural tradition going back thousands of years. The Cyrus Cylinder reveals that Cyrus, as other conquerors before him, decided to comply with certain traditions of ancient Near Eastern city culture by performing specific royal gestures that responded to the expectations of the local urban elites. The Babylonian chronicles inform us that he installed his son Cambyses as king of Babylon on the occasion of the New Year festival, a gesture that acknowledged the paramount role Babylonia was playing among the Persian provinces. He relied equally heavily on existing administrative structures of Babylonia, acknowledging the organization of power in place. It is within this cultural political context that we must interpret the Cyrus cylinder. Various scholars, foremost among them Janos Hamata, have already recognized that the contents of the cylinder could not have been drawn up at the Persian court or chancellery, as at that moment when Cyrus rose to hegemonic power in the ancient Near East, Persian scribes could not yet rely on literary models created in Persia itself. Moreover, the Cyrus cylinder is not only written in Babylonian cuneiform, but also in its literary structure, it reveals great similarities with Babylonian building inscriptions. In other words, the scribe or scholar who wrote this cylinder on behalf of Cyrus was steeped in Babylonian tradition and familiar with both the style of royal building inscriptions and the typical rhetorical features of their discourse. The identity of that scholar, as shown by Irving Finkel in his most recent edition of the Cyrus cylinder, can be even further narrowed down to somebody who had access to the building inscriptions installed 1 century earlier by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. The Assyrian cylinders differed in their physical shape from their Babylonian counterparts in that they used only one column, exactly the format that was used in the Cyrus cylinder. So compare cylinder 1 and cylinder 3, please. Moreover, not only does Cyrus mention an inscription of Ashurbanipal at the end of his text, but also the overall image drawn of the Persian conqueror as overlord of the Babylonians relied on an Assyrian antecedent, even while revealing unique traits that can be only attributed to the time of Cyrus. The cylinder, with its long history of reception, has had many lives, serving the Iranian as well as the Jewish people as an icon of identity. As with many objects throughout history, such an appropriation was and is made possible only by selective readings and interpretations, which do not necessarily take into account the object's original historical context. Today I have been asked to speak about the religious implications of the cylinder, and I would like to do so by investigating what the polytheistic system of Mesopotamia has contributed to the discourse as reflected in the text. In pursuing this question, I would like to ask whether the notion of tolerance towards the Babylonian gods and people, which has been defined a feature particularly typical of Cyrus, is indeed unique, or whether it should rather be considered a typical trait of polytheistic systems in the ancient Near East. In order to understand how polytheism worked and what exactly Cyrus' rhetoric was intended to convey, it is necessary to take a closer look at the construction of identity in antiquity. Contrary to our modern notion of individuality, a person's identity in antiquity was very much shaped by his and her social network, which even reached into the divine world through the practice of ancestor worship. Such worship can be traced back to the Shamida cave in northern Iraq, with archaeological finds such as gifts for the dead dating back to 50,000 BCE, and continues through the history of the Fertile Crescent into the historical periods. The fundamentally revolutionary aspect of such finds from the prehistoric periods is that it reflects cultural adaptive behavior which contributed to a socially transmitted knowledge, such as that represented by the commemoration of the dead, which reinforced metaphorically the community of the living and secured its permanence. In historical times, together with the ancestors, the family god, and on a larger scale, the patron deity of the city and the local pantheon, represented the spatial and historical dimension of identity. The importance of the local temple as an economic household and of the patron deity as its owner is reflected in the particular manner of writing the name of a city, which in the archaic period frequently consisted in the combination of the sign for sanctuary and the name of the patron deity, as attested in the so-called archaic city seals. So you see examples of writing for the city of Larsa and of Ur and of Zabalam, always the sign for the sign up or #3 for sanctuary, and then the sign for the patron deity. It is primarily on the basis of the paramount role played by the temple as an economic institution, fostering social differentiation and hierarchies, that we can explain such types of names. Such writing further indicates that these communities had a strong sense of communal identity bound up with their patron gods. In its most complex structure, then, the social network of the individual consisted of the family, divine ancestors, the protective genius, the personal god or family god, the local pantheon, major deities of the supra-regional pantheon, and the chief god. All of these functioned to determine personal and religious identity. Religion thus operated as a resource for constructing the self as an embedded entity in the multi-layered relationship of one's social network, which extended into the divine world. The other important aspect of polytheism in Mesopotamia is that Sumero-Babylonian culture was primarily city culture. An important aspect of Mesopotamian history is that there never was any enduring political unification in Mesopotamia until the Persian conquest in the mid-1st millennium BCE. When territorial or imperial systems collapsed, the cities represented the core from which political organization re-emerged. Thus, from its beginnings, the South consisted politically of a congery of city-states and culturally of an overarching cultural tradition. The social structure of the early Mesopotamian cities was determined by a mixture of tribal and urban elements, the latter playing out in the diversification of labor, social stratification, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. Indeed, the interesting historical phenomenon Mark van der Meerop has observed from Mesopotamia is that with the progressive territorial expansion of the political units into empires, the cities and their representatives gained increased political independence. This political independence was grounded in an economic independence, which was based on private entrepreneurship. Such political and economic constellations contributed to the strong self-confidence of the cities and their elites, which explains why every ruler who aimed at exercising super-regional control sought to comply with their interest in order to achieve their collaboration. In their inscriptions, however, conquerors would ascribe their achievements of super-regional control to the gods, rather than mention their interaction with the respective representatives of the urban elites. Such religious ideological rhetoric appears in an inscription of King Naram-Sin of Akkad, who extended the borders of the Akkadian Empire to hitherto unseen dimensions towards the end of the 3rd millennium BCE. After having successfully crushed a revolt of various Sumerian city-states in the south, King Naram-Sin projected the vision of a unified territory under divine control, as recorded in an inscription on the so-called Basetsky statue, which was named for the village close to Mosul, where the statue was found. So it says, Naram-Sin the mighty, king of Akkad, when the 4 quarters of the world altogether revolted against him, he won 9 battles in only 1 year through the love Ishtar showed to him. And he captured the kings who had risen against him. Because he preserved the base of his city in these times of crisis, the citizens of his city asked from Ishtar in Anas or in Uruk, from Enlil in Nippur, from Dagan in Tutul, and you get an entire list of divinities and cities, that he be God of their city, and they built a temple for him in the midst of Akkad. Having violently suppressed the rebellion of the cities, Naram-Sin asked nothing less than that those established political and cultic centers acknowledge his elevation to divine status and accept him as god of Akkad. Instead of engaging himself in conversation with the elites of the conquered cities, however, Naram-Sin claimed that the elites of his own city addressed the respective patron deities of the conquered cities, insinuating, for one, a consensus achieved between himself and his own community, and second, a consensus achieved with the patron deities of the conquered cities, who are evoked as representatives of the respective political and religious elites. In the ideological discourse, then, the patron deities were turned into active players in promoting the creation of a unified territory under the hegemonic control of the Sargonic king. Military and political success are presented as a result of the relationship established between the gods and the king, thus tying Naram-Sin's action as an individual ruler into the general cosmic order as it originated with the gods. Naram-Sin inscription stands at the beginning of a long-standing tradition that shaped such religious ideological discourse, one that was reiterated through millennia into the 6th century BCE, as revealed by the discovery of the Cyrus cylinder. Let us turn now to the cylinder itself and consider the claims made by the Persian king. The first larger section, including line 1 to 14, denounces the former Neo-Babylonian ruler Nabonidus for his wicked deeds with regard to Marduk's temple Isangila, his interruption of the regular offerings, and his imposition of heavy labor duties and taxes onto the citizens of Babylon. According to the text, Marduk first raged at the laments of the people and the abandoned cult centers, and then took mercy on his people's suffering and turned to look for a suitable ruler. His choice fell upon Cyrus, king of Anshan, and he named him king of the totality and caused him to triumph over the Gutium and Medes. Pleased by the good deeds of the Persian king, Marduk orders him to take the road to Babylon, which the king enters in triumph and without battle and public rejoicing. Note that after this introduction, which is followed by the genealogy and titulary of Cyrus, the inscription stresses first the king's reverence paid daily to Babylon's patron deity Marduk, and both in tandem Cyrus' fair and benevolent treatment of Babylon's citizens. And I just quote, I only quote the 25 and 26. I sought out the safety of the city of Babylon and all its sanctuaries. As for the population of Babylon, who as without divine intention had endured a yoke not decreed for them, I soothed their weariness, I freed them from their bonds. Marduk, the great Lord, rejoiced at my good deeds. In this passage, Cyrus takes pains to emphasize that the citizens of Babylon went unharmed when his troops entered the city. Even more important, however, is his statement that he soothed their weariness and freed them from their bonds. What exactly does Cyrus refer to with that statement? In my view, Cyrus here elicits a royal gesture known to have been performed by the Assyrian kings when they managed to gain control over Babylonia, a gesture which implied a guarantee of the privileged status of the city of Babylon. In earlier royal inscriptions, the kings referred to this status with various terms that all implied freedom from forced labor for royal projects and tax exemption. exemption. So Anduraru, Kidinutu, Shubaru, and Zakutu. Cyrus' boast of his positive treatment of the citizens of Babylon must thus be seen in the context of the special status that this city, together with the ancient cultic centers of Sippar, Nippur, and Ur, enjoyed in the history of Babylonia. That this status was still known at the time of Cyrus is evident from the reference in one of the Babylonian chronicles to Cyrus' son going into the Nabut Shachareh temple in Babylon on Nisanu 4th and celebrating the New Year festival in his father's stead. The Babylonian New Year's festival is generally thought of as the celebration of Marduk's elevation to the rank of the supreme god of the Babylonian pantheon. There is, however, another crucial aspect to it, and that is that the ritual guaranteed every year anew the tax exemption and freedom accorded to the citizens of Babylon. Indeed, the ritual text contains 2 prayers addressed by the priest to the gods Marduk and his consort Sapanitu that explicitly refer to the privileged citizens, the Sabé Kidini of Babylon. The fact that this plea for the maintenance of the elite privileges appears in the last 2 lines of the prayer addressed to Marduk already on the morning of the 2nd day of the festival, so even before the king appeared as an active participant, shows that the Kidinu status of the privileged citizens was a central aspect to be negotiated during the festival. And I quote from the 2 lines from the prayer: "To Exangla your temple turn your face, establish freedom from service," so Shubaru, "for the citizens of Babylon, your privileged subjects," the Sabé Kidini. The demand of Babylon's elites reappeared in the prayer addressed to the high priest, to Sapanitu, on day 4 of the festival, in which Marduk's consort was requested to assume a mediating role on behalf of the citizens in the divine assembly. "Decree the fate of the king who reveres you. Prolong the life of the citizens of Babylon, your privileged subjects. Intercede for them in front of the king of the gods, Marduk." Only after purification of the temple does the king perform his famous humiliation before Marduk. This rite, known as the negative confession of the king, was probably meant to counterbalance royal intervention in the economic affairs of the temple, managed by the families holding offices in the institution, and to guarantee their privileged status. The king swears in the presence of Marduk and his priest that he has neither infringed upon the cult of Marduk nor upon the privileges of the elites. And I quote just the last part. I quote something which is not written here yet. "He will go out," so the priest will go out and strike the cheek of the king. He will place the king behind him. He will make him enter before Marduk. After this, he will pull his ears, make him kneel on the ground, and together with the king, he will say this once. So now comes the negative confession. "I did not sin, O Lord of the lands. I was not neglectful of your divinity. I did not destroy Babylon. I did not command its dispersal. I did not make Esangila tremble. I did not forget its rights. I did not struck the cheek of any privileged citizen. I did not bring about their humiliation. I have been taking care of Babylon. I have not destroyed its outer walls." After his re-enthronement, the king is slapped a 2nd time, probably as an oracular action. It seems that the significance of the 2nd slapping lies in the precariousness of the office of rulership, which was considered a loan from the gods, not a permanent gift, and would become forfeit should its holder sin against the established order. Again, central to the negative confession, therefore, is the maintenance of the social order as originally ordained by the gods. Another central statement from the Cyrus Cylinder recounts the Persian kings allowing the return of the gods of various cities located in Assyria and the eastern Tigridian region, as well as Sumer and Akkad, to their original home. Unusually, at least in the context of earlier inscriptions, Cyrus emphasizes that he also let return the people of these regions. It is exactly this passage that has been embraced by Jews as historical reference to the return of the ancient Israelites from their exile and the restoration of their cult in Jerusalem. Note, however, that the situation is not so clear, as Jerusalem is not mentioned among the cities, and as a reference to the people probably implied the respective personnel of the divinities, as the temples, in addition to their function as cultic institution, as I have shown, were large economic households. Moreover, this return of the deities under Cyrus is also mentioned in the Babylonian chronicles without any mention of the people. Further, the presence of these various divinities at Babylon notably should not be read as necessarily implying that a kidnapping of gods was performed by Nabonidus. He may well have brought these divinities to Babylon in the face of the Persian threat. The introductory section of the Cyrus Cylinder, elaborating on the misdeeds of Nabonidus vis-à-vis Babylon and the cult of Marduk, as well as the following paragraphs recounting the positive deeds of the conqueror Cyrus in this regard, put the relationship between the Persian king and the city of Babylon and its cult of Marduk at center stage. Only towards the end does the Cyrus Cylinder refer to the restoration performed on the city walls, demonstrating the king's interaction with the citizens and the temple was deemed central to his dealings with Babylon and considered crucial to gain the support of the powerful Babylonian elites. Given all this background and context, how are we to judge the content of the Cyrus Cylinder? Is it all empty rhetoric? The Babylonian chronicles as additional sources of the historical information suggest not. Cyrus Cylinder, with its rhetoric, striving to meet not only expectations prescribed by tradition, but also by the expectations of the actual Babylonian elites, provides us with a portrayal of a statesman who strategically responded to the social historical conditions of the Babylonian capital. The Cyrus Cylinder thus stands in line with the earlier Ashurbanipal's cylinder and the later cylinder of Antiochus, all testifying to the longevity of the image of the ideal conqueror striving to interact properly with local tradition and the expectations of the citizens of the particular city for which the inscription was written. This message was carefully constructed with the help of local scholars, and it could well be that it was primarily produced to satisfy a divine audience, and that Cyrus never saw or knew of it, the goal being rather to provide written testimony of his perpetuation of the harmonious balance between earthly kingship and cosmic order according to the Sumerian Babylonian worldview. The correspondence between King Ashurbanipal and his scholars, revealing a statesman who was actively involved in his image-making, however, suggests Cyrus may have taken an active role in the crafting of this cylinder's message. Whether the Cyrus cylinder reflects some historical truth, unfortunately remains uncertain, and so should not be of primary relevance to modern interpretation. What is evident, and what is, to my view, also much more interesting, is to see that conqueror and conquered alike strove to represent the new king of Babylon in the guise of time-honored tradition. I thank you for your attention.
have several minutes left for questions. To open the floor.
Yes, I would like to know why Cyrus and the Cylinder became so famous, not Hammurabi and not Hammurabi and his colleague.
I think it is mere questions. Your question? The lady asked why the Cyrus cylinder became so famous and not, for example, the code of Hammurabi from Shusha. Well, I think it is because, just by coincidence, because Cyrus became well known in Greek and Hebrew sources. If, for example, the Hebrews or the Greeks have made contact with Nabopolassar or Sargon II of Assyria before, then these kings would have been prime examples of best kings of the world, checked and picked by Marduk himself. Hammurabi just was too early, and it was the cylinder, his dealer from Shusha only interested the field of Assyriology and not the larger field of modern Persian, Iranian people who fostered Cyrus as an ancient king and as a modern king. I think it's just coincidence.
Yeah.
The cylinder is not so very interesting in many respects.
Yeah,
It's quite traditional.
It makes more sense.
No.
And it's older, much older.
Yeah, but the Cyrus cylinder just speaks to two living peoples, to the Persians and to the Jews. And so these peoples have an interest. If the people of Samaria or of Tyre or of Ashdod would still be living, they could bond to other texts from these things. I think it's mere coincidence.
I just wanted to thank you very much for your talk, because what you were saying, and I think you said that again too, what you are sorry, what you're implying is a very strong literary tradition that came down from the 3rd millennium BC, and with an awareness that came down to the mid-1st millennium BC, and with that also a strong awareness of the historical self of these kings, because they saw themselves in a historical line, which Cyrus also did, which Darius did, King of Kings. That's how we interpret the title, that I'm one among many. And I find to extrapolate that from both your papers very intriguing, but certainly from the way that you bring up the examples of the links in the accusation or the bad deeds of the kings and the evil doing. I found that very, very eye-opening. Thank you. Sorry.
And I think that once more shows how much we have to think and haven't thought so far about the agency of the people who wrote this cylinder. I mean, this concerns the making of reliefs in far distant region in the Levant, as it does the fabrication of such inscriptions. We always, because the king talks in the first person, we take him as the ideal author, but the question really is, on whom did he rely to draft the inscription? And the example Hans-Peter showed was that they must be steeped in tradition, because the Widener Chronicle is a highly, highly erudite text, which can only be relied upon if I am completely familiar with Sumer-Babylonian tradition. Yeah. So my idea also is that probably it was a Babylonian scholar who knew about the long-standing tradition who drafted this, and not anybody of the Persian code. Yeah. Not even, Elamite context, which came up to some degree in David's talk, because they were very familiar with Babylonian tradition, and you could think some kind of continuity, Elam, Persia. But I think when it comes to scholarly, erudite law, you need specialists and experts, and they are only to be found in Babylon.
It is in Babylon, so you don't need to look for it. Whereas in Anshan, it had to be created. That's why I think the problem of the transition, an empire people needs to establish itself, and you rely on the existing scribal tradition. That's why you have Elamites writing the accounts in Persepolis and writing the letters for the accounts before you then might move on to either your own or what I think that is Aramaic, because it's there, it's adopted. But I can see that why there is a break, and there is some extent of a break.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much for the presentation.
Generally, in discussions or writing of political dissertations, archaeological discoveries, and philosophies, and all sorts of things, the word, I think, is misused. The word tolerance is misused. I probably heard it only once being said here. But I would like to submit to you that the word tolerance is not what Cyrus showed. It is not tolerance when he says, told, by the way, means a weight. Tolerance means carrying a weight. In Farsi we have bari, same thing. Bar means weight. I'm carrying your weight. I do not agree with your faith, but I carry it as a weight because you are human and because of that. In Arabic also it's the same thing. Tahammul means to carry a weight. Cyrus says here, I did not destroy Babylon. I did not command its dispersal. I did not make Isagila tremble. I did not forget its rights.
No. This is actually a Babylonian king, much later.
But
this is actually a Babylonian king.
yes.
This is from a...
So just to clarify, this text is from the New Year Festival.
But in Cyrus's cylinder, it's also the same. And he showed it by... okay, thank you. But he also showed by his actions that he did not destroy, but on the contrary, he restored the walls of Babylon, where he found this cylinder. So, the word tolerance, I don't think is the correct word. It should be a respect. What Cyrus did in Babylon, with the Babylonian people, with their beliefs, in Ur, in Jerusalem, in whatever he did, it was the respect that he showed. He did not carry their religion or their belief or their suffering as a toll. So I'm just saying that in dissertations that you do, please make note of the fact that tolerance is not a good thing. It suggests that you are carrying somebody's load, but it should be a respect, just as Cyrus. Thank you.
Any further questions? Please, just stand up and say.
Yes, please. I'm probably picked up the microphone. I was just curious, with the Cyrus cylinder and with the early literary models that we've been looking at here, it seems to me like Cyrus and the earlier model kings are very much trying to appeal to the Babylonian, whether it be religious or legal audience, and we're not seeing that much of them, not much about their political identity. And I know Dr. Schroeder said it's, it's an apology that they're presenting to the Babylonian audience. How much in these other examples
examples do you see, whether it be Ashurbanipal or the early examples, how much do you see their political identity coming forward that they're completely, they're presenting to the Babylonians?
Well, in particular, in these earlier examples of Nabopolassar or Sargon II, I do not see any individual policy of the kings. It is a standard procedure. If you have proposed a predecessor with force, you have to give a reason. In particular, if it was a relative, a brother, or a nephew. So you've got to tell the audience why this man had to go or had to be killed. And this is what the earlier kings do. Sargon II is very clear. It is, of course, Ashur, king of the gods, who overthrew his rule and his reign, but it must have been a human king who killed him, perhaps Sargon II himself. And Nabonidus, of course, came to the throne with divine support, and his predecessor, Labashmaruto, had to be killed. You know from the gossip that he was killed because he had a bad character, had to pay out. But this is in fact not an individual political agenda of these kings, but it is part of the traditional take you take to the situations.
I mean, it has exactly to do with the fact that the urban communities link themselves up so much with the patron deity in their identity. So the argument goes with that this patron deity shows the new conqueror, the new king. So I would say that it is a deliberate choice, still a deliberate choice of the new conqueror to embrace these communities, because he could have chosen to just crush them completely, which they did in some cases, but it depended regionally, really very much, it depended really geographically and regionally on which city they conquered, whether they would decide to make an argument which was also religiously oriented towards the patron deity of the particular conquered city, or whether they say, oh, I strew soil over the entire region so that nothing could grow anymore. Yeah, you find both arguments, and so I would a little bit modify perhaps and say it depends politically, economically, religiously, what kind of rhetoric I choose. But it's definitely bound up with the highly powerful religious and political needs of the cities.
So none of them ever did, none of them suggest they're bringing something new into the region. They're bringing anything really better from the outside, because we're mostly talking about outsiders, correct, conquering kings. So it's very formulaic for a Bible.
Mrs. Conversation is absolutely right. There are, of course, cases when you just distinguish communities, but this only applies to foreign countries with people who wouldn't interfere. This is all Babylonian or Assyrian Babylonian talk. This is talk between, in fact, one community. You can't just exterminate a Babylonian city. Sennacherib, the king of Ashur, did it once, and it broke his neck, and it was even this single example was an outrageous singular event. In fact, we do not, with Babylonian cities, we would always try to argue and to discuss and to set matters in a tripartite way. With foreign countries, with Hittites or with barbarian countries, you can take these matters she referred to, you can just burn the city down and throw salt in it so it shall never grow. But this is not done with Babylonian cities.
But that is in stark contrast to what the Persians do, where Cyrus, on the one hand, takes over from previous kings, but at the same time he's expanding that because he's building a world empire. Because when he conquers Media, when he conquers Lydia and the East, he does not go on a path of destruction, but he maintains that same religious acceptance there. And then it becomes a political stance. So
think you're perfectly right, and there are two examples. Normally, you kill the king of a foreign country, but he did not kill Astyages, he took him prisoner, and he did not kill Nabonidus, and he did not kill, according to the latest clauses. This is so something new started, but within the text of the cylinder, everything is like it always would have been. In the cylinder there is nothing to see.
But if you take, I'm sorry, I don't want to take up, but if you take, for example, the Catholic, the Rice's letter to the Dantas, where he acknowledges that the Satrap of Magnesia it's his responsibility to take care of the gardens, of the sacred gardens of the god Apollo. If you see that Dantas, the Mede, sacrificed at Naxos, the temple of Apollo, on the way to Greece in 490, that they offered to rebuild the temple in Athens in 480-79, you see that as a still working policy, that you, if you, to whatever extent you conquer, or things happen to have been destroyed, if you go to a foreign territory, or any foreign territory is under your authority, you maintain it, and you do what you can to maintain it.
But I think Xerxes, with the Apollon of Pneuma and the Artemis of Dauron, did another job. He destroyed the sanctuaries and took the images to Susa. Okay.
Yeah, well, they do both. They do both. There's, I published an article that is called Persian Diplomacy Between Persian Peace and Zero Tolerance. And that's exactly it. If you didn't play ball, you would get punished. But as in the first instance of the approach to another country that would be under your sovereignty, you would accept it and you would support it.
Yeah, but sorry, Nebuchadnezzar didn't do that. Didn't do all that. He destroyed.
Well, but Nebuchadnezzar followed a policy set as an example by the Syrians and other ancient Eastern kings. You only destroy when the conquered enemy breaks his contract. You know, he conquered Jerusalem twice. The first time, he conquered it for Babylonia, and then he set up a treaty with the king. And only when this treaty is vulnerated, the king comes back and publishes the city. This is always the pattern we can see in Assyrian and Roman scriptures, and even with Persians. When you come first, this enemy is conquered, and he's of course not to be punished to be a foreign enemy, foreign king, but only when he violates the new treaties, then you've got to punish him. Then you destroy the city and take the king to exile.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's take this over, let's discuss this over lunch. We're going to close the session at this point, and I think we're very much right. First of all, speakers.
Physics in archaeology as kind of an X-ray prior to real excavation. He subsequently moved to both the Persian Gulf and Central Asia, and most recently has been back in Iran doing geophysics again and more wide landscape survey in the area of Pasargadae. And his title is Cyrus and Pasargadae, Foregoing an Empire, Fashioning Paradise. It should be very interesting, and I'd like you to join me in welcoming Rémi Bouchala from the University of Lyon in France.
Thank you very much for this kind, short biography. I'm very glad to take part in this conference here, and I express my warm thanks to the Iranian Study program, and especially to Professor Shahizan for organizing it and for the invitation. I'm very honored on that occasion to present some new data on Pasargadae. they enrich what we already knew of Cyrus' achievements. As a matter of fact, the new data make this activity more ambitious than expected before, and at the same time, more complicated to be understood. More I have worked in Pasargadae in the last 10 years, more I was puzzled by the history of the site building as we know it today. Besides the admiration for Cyrus, I'd like to raise two questions which are linked together. How and when was Cyrus able to conceive his residence, to control the progress of the work, since he was so often away from France, conquering and building his empire? And second question, how was he in position to conceive Pasargadae, for which he selected several different traditions from the Near East and from Western Asia Minor, and at the same time was able to invent many Iranian or Persian features? This is my two questions, of course, without answering precisely. Geography and chronology of Cyrus' conquest form only a part of the explanation for the external influences, better to say, borrowing. Some of them are well known, such as the Ionian column, or ashlar masonry as it was used for the Talit art. But for other borrowing, very likely, the Persian knew already a lot on Mesopotamian and, of course, on Elamite traditions, maybe indirectly from other farther countries. But who were these Persians around Cyrus? A well-informed and educated elite? What were their function and autonomy when Cyrus was far from Pasargadae? I'd like to start with a brief overview of Cyrus' conquest, just for showing that Cyrus was more often than not absent from France. After 560, Cyrus started expanding his own kingdom, which certainly was not only a population of nomads and shepherds. Around 553, Cyrus had been fighting the Medes. He finally defeated them, the Median army, maybe in Pasargadae, according to some authors like Strabo. Did he start to build Pasargadae at that time? In any case, for settling there, he had to bring water. For the court, the guard, and soon the hundreds of masons and workers in charge of building the city, water should be easily available. As a matter of fact, the Pulvar River is far from the central part of the site, about 1 kilometer to the east, and deeply incised. Certainly, the first duty was to dig a canal across the site, which is in front of that slide, and for filling this canal, creating the derivation from the Pulvar River, a derivation which is still active today. Then Cyrus decided to conquer Asia Minor, especially Croesus' Lydian kingdom, with Sardis, its capital. The conquest of such a distant and powerful kingdom required careful preparation and gathering allied troops. That takes time, several months at least. Finally, Cyrus wins around 545 or a bit earlier, depending on hypothesis. Then he continued on his way to the Ionian city along the Mediterranean Sea. That demands time to be counted in terms of several months, because after the conquest he has to organize the satrapies, the administration, to install the governor, to install a permanent garrison. Cyrus is definitely the organizer of the empire, before Darius, who completed the work, but Cyrus himself was the conqueror and the organizer of the empire. Then probably Cyrus came back to Persia only for a while, and he went then to Eastern Iran to secure the eastern part of the former Median world. I don't say Median Empire. Then Babylon. Cyrus officially said he made a peaceful entry in Babylon. We have seen that this morning in 533. But we also knew that that was preceded by battles and negotiations, a period to be counted again in terms of several months. After the capture, the entry in Babylon, the former immense Neo-Babylonian kingdom had to be reorganized according to the new administration. Cyrus should be there often or for long periods. According to Xenophon, Xenophon says Cyrus spent 7 months a year because this is a central part of the empire which requires careful work from Cyrus. Finally, the last years of Cyrus are occupied by extending his conquest in Central Asia until his death in 530. As a result, Cyrus could not be often and for long in Pasargadae. Therefore, in his absence, he should have delegated to one, to several persons whom he could rely on. Now, Pasargadae before Cyrus. There is no archaeological evidence of previous occupation of Pasargadae before Cyrus. According to ancient and recent surveys and excavations, on the site itself and in the Tangibulari Valley nearby, there is a huge chronological gap between, say, the 4th millennium BC and the Achaemenid period, or almost 3,000 years gap. Maybe flimsy occupation in between, but doesn't count. No evidence of pre-Achaemenid occupation corresponding to the emergence of the Persian power, but this is the case for the whole Central Fars, and this is certainly one of the major challenges of the Iranian history. Dan Potts' hypothesis of Malian as a city of origin of Cyrus is interesting, but we have seen that this morning it's not based on firm ground for the moment. Most of the stone construction in Pasargadae could not have been undertook before the conquest of Asia Minor in 545. One can guess that the Caesar of the former Eurasian kingdom preceded that of Western Asia Minor, but most of the stone techniques and decoration are borrowed from Lydian and Ionian territories, that is the western part of Asia Minor. And that is to say that can be undertook before the mid-6th century BC. For sure, Cyrus visited a number of temples in the Greek cities, the temple being the most visual achievement of Greek architecture, but from that, he and his counselor, who are they? Question. He or they selected only some components and employed them for a quite different architecture. Just an example, the well-known hypostyle room, hall, which was unknown to the Greek. The Greek knew the porticos around the temple, but not the columned hall inside. Just an example. But the column itself, at the top of the slide, is obviously an imitation of a Greek temple like Milet. After the conquest of Babylon, or very likely much before that event, the Persians knew a lot about Mesopotamian art, as we know from the recently found elite graves in between Fars and Khuzestan, like Arjan, we mentioned it this morning, or the quite recently found in the Behberan area of the same kind of luxus goods in the graves. In Assyria, the mud brick buildings themselves of the New Assyrian Empire were probably decayed at the Cyrus period of time, after the fall of Nineveh, but the stone sculpture was probably partly preserved and visible. As an example again, the four-winged Genius at the gate R in Pasargadae in turn is a mix of Elamite and Neo-Assyrian and even Egyptianizing components, but it's used in a building which is clearly a Persian innovation. This isolated gate as a building without rampart is a Persian or Iranian innovation. The borrowing of non-Persian components, yeah, I put on above the slide, above the gate R. The upper part of the slide is a newly found palace in Republic of Azerbaijan, Karachamirli, which offer also the same kind of isolated gate as in Pasargadae, which was invented in Pasargadae by Cyrus. The borrowing of non-Persian components has been precisely analyzed, especially by David Stronach in his book and in several articles. And these non-Persian components used in Pasargadae, in a way, does not raise too much problem, despite some pending questions of origin and function, as it is for the Zindan Soleiman Tower. The origin of the deeper changes and innovation Cyrus and his advisor introduced in Pasargadae are more difficult to track down. Beside the issue mentioned here, let me make two remarks. We have no idea of the concept and reality of a Persian city before Cyrus, that is in the first half of the 6th century BC. We have no example, we don't know any of them. Second point is stone masonry, especially ashlar masonry and its implementation, were totally unknown to the pre-Achaemenid Persians as far as we know. It's a complete borrowing from Persian Minor. In Pasargadae, the layout, if we can call urbanism, the plan you have on the screen, is quite new in the Near East. In particular, it lacks two major components. We can note the absence of an actual city wall or a rampart, and the absence also of a town for common people. For the latter point, for the town for the population and the workers, which should have existed somewhere. One of the hypotheses could be the series of large buildings protected within the outer polygonal defense wall on the top with the red arrow. However, the size of the architectural blocks, between 20 or 40 meters long, tends to see them rather as barracks or storage buildings rather than individual houses for common people. The city remains, the town remains a question in Pasargadae, but definitely Pasargadae is not on the model of the previous Mesopotamian city. Some examples here, that usually with the ramparts systematically protected by the ramparts. And for the plan and distribution of the palatial building, you can see that on the top right. This is a typical Mesopotamian building, a compact architecture organized around the courtyard. Pasargadae doesn't offer at all this kind of plan. Now for my issues, I'll show some buildings and devices in or around Pasargadae, asking, is this deriving from a Near Eastern or Asia Minor heritage rooted in the culture of one of the conquered region? If it is a Persian innovation, do we have any idea of its origin, of the origins Cyrus selected? I must say I'm not in a position to offer a clear answer. One of the most striking features in Pasargadae is certainly the royal garden, covering some 4 hectares according to the layout of the stone water courses. David Stronach has produced similar studies on it, and I have nothing to add, just recalling that for sure the Neo-Assyrian kings created also garden, but the rectilinear geometric layout of Pasargad and the water courses very visible are Persian creations. Another difference, while the Neo-Assyrians and the so-called Hanging Garden of Babylon intended to recreate hills and terraces, in Pasargad, Cyrus conversely contrasts a flat garden with a hill and mountains which surround the site. Let me illustrate again possible Pasargad influence some decades later, again in Karachamirli in Azerbaijan, where for the moment, in Karachamirli, where for the moment we can compare the loose distribution of the official building on the site with Pasargad, with a reconstruction of a recently published article by the German Nazari expedition. Water plays a more important role than expected in the Cyrus residence. Along the southeast side of the Royal Garden, the geomagnetic survey has revealed that the stream, it's not a river, it's a canal, artificial, has been completely transformed into a huge pond, trapezoidal in shape, more than 200 meters long, and between 50 and 60 meters in width. At its western end, it's crossed by a bridge. The visitor takes when arriving through the monumental gate, the gate R. Such a piece of water in this landscape was certainly very impressive. Besides the Cyrus creation, the devices for controlling the water flow should have also an external, non-Persian origin. It seems to be a series of six small sluice gates upstream and again downstream after the bridge. This point should be checked by excavation. But that device reminds some aspect of Neo-Assyrian technology, water technology, not Urartian as far as I know, and closer to Pasargad, the water device in Chorazanbil, but this one is much older, about 8 centuries earlier than Pasargad, during the Middle Elamite period. Concerning the hydraulic technology used by Cyrus, there are examples of much more sophisticated device, so exceptional, as far as I know, that for the moment we have no idea what they were built for, I must say. This is my point 5. 2 dams have been studied and partly excavated by a joint Iran-France team at some 25 kilometers north of Pasargad, but in relation with Pasargad, across the Pulvar River at an altitude of 2,000 meters. Certainly the dams intended to control the water flow, retaining it in spring during the snow melting in a huge natural reservoir of millions of cubic meters, then providing a continuous flow in the dry season. The excavated dam shows a very high quality of stone masonry, well-drafted limestone blocks of 1 to 2.5 meters long, using the Greek technique of anathiosis for joining blocks without mortar, and using both dovetail and straight-side iron clamps with lead. This is the typical Achaemenid masonry inspired by Lydian Ionian architecture. And this dam is clearly dated, securely dated by radiocarbon of the late 6th, early 5th century BC. The stone device is on the top of the dam. This is a stone structure 11 meters long, consisting, as you can see, of a main conduit. Then the flow is divided up into 6 small channels. Each of them could be closed by a sluice gate. The slot remains, I can't show it. Then this channel arriving in a room with 3 stone pillars, very likely for supporting a roof. but the back is apparently open, completely open. Any suggestion about the possible function or functions of this monument is most welcome. 2 kilometers downstream, another dam, which is higher but across a narrow valley, offered the same kind of stone device, though badly preserved. But in that case, installed at the bottom of the dam. We notice the smaller size of the stone and the lack of dovetail clamps. This dam could be a little bit later than the former. With this very astonishing device, I ask again my question: who were the engineers, from which country, and how did the Persians, or the advisor in charge of managing landscape around Pasargadae, find them and implement this work? This remains the question. Also worth mentioning remains of Achaemenid investment for irrigating dozens of hectares in the area south of Pasargadae, in the tank in Mulabi Valley. Here again, stone cutting technique was widely used for digging rock cut canals on both sides of the river in the narrow part of the gorge. And again, one can find such very important works in the rock in Urartu and also in Assyria, from where the architects probably learned the way to have a sloping of 1 or 2 for 1,000, not persons, but a sloping in 1 to 2 for 1,000. Can you imagine to create a canal of such a gentle slope to be carefully checked on 17 kilometers long? What is surprising is the abandonment of the work for the main canal, which was left unfinished. It is corresponding to the end of the major role of Pasargadae after Cyrus' death, or maybe after Cambyses. As a conclusion, back to the central part of Pasargadae, some word about the paradise. Between the Royal Garden and the Zindan Tower, one of the geomagnetic survey has evinced a sort of very regular grid covering several hectares. The size of this square or rectangle, between 30 and 60 meters, may well correspond to parcels delimited by irrigation dishes. One comes to the conclusion, or to the hypothesis, that a large part, if not the whole flat area of Pasargadae, formed what the Greek writers called a paradise. Strabo and Arrian witnessed that there was a paradise around Cyrus' tomb, paradise being meadow and trees around Cyrus' tomb. But one cannot conclude that this part did not extend on a much wider area than the one seen by the Alexander companions. And probably this area could cover the major part of the flat area of the site. And on the right side, this is a reconstruction. David and myself, we took part for advising the author of this book, published last year, to encourage him and sometimes stopping him in some reconstruction. It's a very interesting job in any case for us. An original city layout, the geometric garden, and the paradise are but a few new components created in Achaemenid art and architecture during Cyrus' reign, by himself and the Persians around him. Some decades later, Persepolis will follow a different scheme, but the concept of a city covering a large area and preserving many unbuilt lands for agriculture and gardens will be maintained in Persepolis, also according to another of our work with geomagnetic survey. Pasargadae layout has long seemed to be unique. The recent discovery of the Achaemenid complex in Karachamirli is an invitation to reconsider our view and to see it as an illustration of the Persian paradise, which was celebrated by the classical authors in many satrapies. This is but one of the inventions which should be credited to Cyrus. It remains to find how and from where this Persian innovation came to his mind. Thank you.
I would now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Rahim Shayagan, who is the organizer of this conference, and to tell you a little bit about some of his works. His most recent volume is on aspects of history and epic in ancient Iran, and he has also written a major work on this is a hard word to pronounce, but Arsacids and Sasanians, Political Ideology in Post-Hellenistic and Late Antique Persia. Dr. Shayagan is an unusual in having command of many languages, not just the Iranian ones and the European ones, but cuneiform and a few others which I don't even pretend to understand. So I'd like you to welcome him and to introduce his talk, which is entitled Cyrus, Darius, and the Achaemenid World Order.
Thank you very much for coming so numerous to this occasion. Many thanks to my colleagues, to Sir Carter for this exceedingly kind introduction. I don't know the languages myself now. So without further ado, because we are behind schedule, I shall delve into it and eliminate a number of pages you shall be happy to hear. In 492, before the Common Era, in the aftermath of the Ionian Revolt, which in 499 gripped the Greek cities of Asia Minor under Persian dominion, something extraordinary happened. Upon reconquering the rebellious Greek cities, the Persian authority refrained from restoring the autocratic Greek rulers, the Tyrannoi, who had ruled over these cities with the consent of the great king, but instead, in response to the desire of the Ionian cities, Darius I, through the agency of the new supreme commander of Asia Minor, Mardonius, therein established the democratic governments. If indeed true, we would be astounded today, as was the father of history, Herodotus, over 2 millennia ago, while reporting on these events in the 4th century. He thus reports, at the beginning of the spring, other commanders, having all been removed by the king, Mardonius, the son of Cobrias, came down to the sea, bringing with him a very large land army and a very large naval force. Mardonius, however, sailing along the coast of Asia, came to Ionia, and here I shall relate a thing which will be a great marvel to the Hellenes, and that is Herodotus speaking. Mardonius deposed all the tyrants of the Ionians and established popular governments in the cities. O Mardonius, democratias catista estas polias. Indeed, how could an empire whose innermost political structure, its ethos of government, was based upon the infallibility of the great king, on the boundless powers of its sovereign, whose culture was fiercely autocratic and hierarchical, tolerate the coexistence of democracies within its boundaries? How could isonomic aspirations and democratic self-determinism be allowed to create a pocket of particularism within its sovereign space? It is true that the Ionian experiment with local democracies did not affect the traditions of the empire, nor affect the ways of its dominant ethnoclass, the Median and Persian elements. But for the great king to suffer that the imperial sphere be invested by an opposite notion of governance and sovereignty either signifies the inability to enforce its design, which in the aftermath of the Ionian Revolt was certainly not the case, or a pragmatic but ephemeral concession to the rebellious polis of Asia Minor, an action which, however, could have set a dangerous precedence for the stability of the heterogeneous Achaemenid Empire. Or simply it may have reflected a philosophy of government, a concept of empire that afforded the integration of the opposites without the fear of endangering its core tenets. There is no doubt where our sympathies lie, and we shall endeavor to investigate in your company today, whether the treatment of the cities of Asia Minor and the permission afforded by the empire for them to govern themselves within the imperial sphere was a singular occurrence, or whether there is evidence of a systemic permissiveness by the empire in the exercise of political particularism, which would be testimony not of an old and ill-defined oriental largesse or tolerance, but symptomatic of a distinct paradigm of political governance. From among the evidence we like to introduce today that are rather still subject to intense scholarly discussions and often reflect the whim of the interpreter's empathies, from among this evidence, several stand out. One being the Cyrus cylinder, obviously, since it is the theme of the day. Another, the missions of Ezra and Nehemiah as imperial envoys of the great king to Jerusalem, possibly in the first half of the 5th century before the Common Era, as related in the Bible. Yet another, the codification of Egyptian law as recorded by a demotic document. And finally, time permitting and child, the Elamite Persepolis and treasury tablets. Allow us first to have a glance at the Cyrus cylinder, about which my esteemed colleagues Hans-Peter Schaudig and Beate von Gratz-Leisten have so eloquently spoken this morning. The Cyrus cylinder, as we shall remind our guests today, was a Babylonian document redacted by Babylonian scribes for the benefit of a Babylonian audience on Babylonian matters on behalf of Persian rule in Babylon. So we are clear on that. The cylinder, an excellent piece of Persian imperial propaganda, not only reminds its Babylonian audience of the neglect of the city, its god Marduk and the temple Ezekiel, by King Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar, but also of the restoration of Marduk's temple, the return of other Babylonian gods bereft from other cities and taken to Babylon, to their former sanctuaries, the rehabilitation of these temples, and the sanction by Persian authorities of material support, although a very thrifty one, and provisionment. It is clear that the cylinder, albeit admirable on its own merit, may not suffice either to define Cyrus's imperial policy towards other religions, or that of the Achaemenids in general, and we shall require recourse to other evidence to determine the contours of such policy. Thus, the question is whether we may speak of an Achaemenid policy in religious matters, or in the political arena that was distinctly at odds with the state of affairs in prior empires of Mesopotamia, and was characterized by the willingness of the central authority to allow for a limited political autonomy or individual religious practices by the empire's heterogeneous constituencies. Or, what is more, whether beyond this permissiveness, the empire was even supportive of local cultural practices by sustaining them, as explicitly mentioned in the Cyrus cylinder and other documents, with financial means or even regulating their rituals. Many examples have been discussed in the past to make a case for an Achaemenid religious policy that would, as a matter of state doctrine, facilitate local religious or cultural practices, especially around the so-called imperial authorization theory, the so-called Reichsautorisationsgesetz, which was vigorously discussed among biblical scholars in the past decades, before much of the evidence was dismissed from Hellenist quarters, some justifiably, and some, in my opinion, maybe prematurely. One such evidence is a testimony of the Ketuvim, more particularly the book of Ezra. Therein, we are informed that by dint of a royal edict of Framana, whose historicity may be contestable, and Ezra, whose existence as a historical figure has also been contested, a teacher versed in the law of Moses was sent together with his retinue, bestowed with considerable financial means to revive the temple of Jerusalem. His mission is fourfold. First, it consists of Ezra's inquiring about the law of his God in Judea. Second, Ezra was to appoint magistrates and judges to administer the self-same law. Thirdly, all those unaware of Moses' law were to be taught accordingly. And finally, those not complying to the laws that Ezra possessed, that is, that were sanctioned by the king's law, were to be punished in sundry ways. It seems that the book of Ezra, while speaking of the laws of Ezra's God, might refer to the laws of Moses, the Pentateuch, as a teacher of which he has been introduced from the outset. What would be of importance in this context, if indeed the law of God were to indicate the Torah, is in its juxtaposition to the law of the king, subtly signaling that the canon which Ezra was required to impose upon the Jewish ethnos, notwithstanding the inner mechanisms at play in its compilation,
owed its enforceability and validity to the king's law, the data, the mother law. And they were sanctioned by the entire weight of the empire. At first glance, the granting of democratic regiments to the cities of Asia Minor and the sanction by the empire of Ezra's body of laws as binding for the entire Jewish population of Trans-Euphrates might have not much in common. The latter case represented an attempt to make canonical an extant juridical and religious compilation and forcing it upon possible diverging currents and factions within the self-same community. In the former case, a seemingly pragmatic solution was found to account for the desire of citizens of Ionian Polis to exercise self-rule, without any mention of laws and constitutions being composed by the self-same polis that could be offered for endorsement and inclusion in the body of the king's law, so-called data. If it were not for a succinct notice by Diodorus, who, reporting on the deeds of the Persian commander Mardonius in Asia Minor, expresses verbis mentions the restitution to the Greek polis of their nomoi, that is, the customs and laws, while acting on behalf of the great king. If so, in both cases the empire had authorized the exercise of particular laws, be it the constitution of a self-regulating polis, or laws regulating the life and religious exercise of a particular ethnos, by endorsing it and by making it binding for the entire community, for which it was intended. Thus, although acquiescing to the particularism of autonomy of distinct communities within the empire, de facto, however, equalizing all differences and fractions within that group through collectively binding laws. But there is a tertio comparationis, which shall be shedding, hopefully, further light on the nature of the so-called data that I am mentioning time and again. On the reverse of a papyrus of Hellenistic provenance, whose obverse originally contained the so-called Demotic Chronicle, sundry unrelated Demotic texts have been accidentally preserved, which are possibly copied from all the material by a scribe. One of the texts on the reverse reports on Darius's compilation of Egyptian law. The document mentions that Darius ordered the old laws of Egypt to be recorded, which was compiled at his command into a book in Demotic and in Assyrian scripts, the latter referring to Imperial Aramaic, the language of that unit administration. Complemented is the Demotic evidence by the report of Diodorus again, mentioning 6 Egyptian kings and legislators, the so-called Nomothetes of the past, among them Darius, who is merely paraphrased as one who has dealt, epistenai, with Egyptian law, rather than being a legislator. It is clear from the tenor of these two documents that Darius was not deemed to have generated new law, but similar to the cases of the Ionian Polis and the laws submitted by Ezra on behalf of the great king, to have merely compiled extant local rules and regulations and made them binding for Egypt. Let us now move to the third piece of evidence. These are the Elamite tablets. To remind our audience, the Elamite tablets, in particular the fortification tablets, are administrative records on clay belonging to the reign of Darius I, from the end of the 6th to the beginning of the 5th centuries, and represented payments made by the royal administration at Persepolis, Parsa, to different officials on the purview of Persepolitan scribes for a wide range of purposes, including cultural and religious services. What is striking in this document is the imperial administration enabling the religious services of a great variety of gods, both Iranian and Elamite, as well as Babylonian. Altogether, many different kinds of religious services performed by many types of priests, parading both Elamite and Old Persian titles, such as the Shatem, the Magush, the fireplace, Atar Bakhsha, and others are mentioned. Although most of the gods are clearly Iranian, such as Ahura Mazda, Spintarmaitish, and Artanafravartish, there are also Elamite and Babylonian ones. But Ahura Mazda does not seem to have the exalted position and uncontested position that he has in the inscriptions of the same period, as we shall find out in a moment. Thus, the Elamite documents could suggest, as it has been vigorously argued in recent years, that cultural practices at display at Persepolis supported the idea that the Achaemenid religion irrespective of its core tenets, might have represented an aggregate of Elamite and Persian religious elements. Indeed, the long process of cross-cultural interactions between Elamites and Persians on the Iranian plateau over the span of several centuries prior to the formation of the empire ought to have decisively shaped Persian identity, which, in spite of its Indo-Iranian heritage, may be reckoned as the culmination of this acculturation. As denoted in the Persepolis fortification tablets, a majority of scribes bear Iranian names and appear to be Iranophones, writing an Elamite that shows the impact of old Persian morphological and syntactical impositions. Thus, the same might have been true also for Achaemenid religious practices, which could have been shaped by the process of Persian and Elamite acculturation as well, whereby Elamite gods like Humban were adopted and worshipped along Iranian divinities, many of whom known to us from the Mazayasnian pantheon. Thus, if this picture were to be true, then an argument could be made that Persian exposure to Elamite culture and its subsequent adoption of Elamite divinities and cultural practices may have been instrumental in creating an aptitude of permissiveness more tolerant of religious others. But this proposition may not be borne out by the tenor of the Achaemenid royal inscriptions. In essence, the inscriptions convey the following message as the exalted position of the supreme god Ahura Mazda and his synergy with the great king is concerned. Ahura Mazda is represented as the greatest of gods, who has set the cosmos in motion, and the verb used is da, as in data, and regulated the world through order, artha. Darius, in return, is depicted as a follower of Ahura Mazda, who, as a reward, was bestowed by him with his kingship, thereby allowing Darius to administer orderly his dominion by dint of his laws, data, that are in this world, in the world of Darius, reminiscent of the cosmic order, namely the Artha, Ahura Mazda has fashioned. Darius, through his actions, opposes the lie, which emanates from evil, and through his deeds, personal ethics, and laws, the data reenacts the cosmic war between order and chaos. At first glance, there seems to be a profound rift in our documentary evidence between the ideological message conveyed in the inscriptions, where Ahura Mazda reigns supreme, or the other divine creatures also populate this thrifty place, and the pantheic festival we observe in the Elamite tablets. There is no doubt that the resolution of tensions prevailing between contemporaneous sources, radically at variance with each other, provides the key for evaluating the Achaemenid religious policy in total. Much effort has been spent in scholarship on reconciling the contradictory testimonies on the state of Achaemenid religious affairs. In order to understand some of the issues at stake, I have to ask the audience for his indulgence once more to introduce a new piece of information. As we have mentioned previously, the Elamite tablets knew of a variety of gods and a variety of religious services to honor them. Among the principal services on record, the one designated under the name Lan, which is an Elamite word for sacrifice, basically meaning sacrifice, was celebrated on a grand scale by the administration, judging from the large quantity of provisions recorded for it, and was either listed in conjunction with the names of deities and divinities such as Daruva, Huvaira, Earth, Visai Bagai, and occasionally Ahura Mazda, or without further specifications altogether. As Ahura Mazda itself is rarely mentioned in these tablets, it was traditionally assumed that the land service ought to have been the official service for the supreme deity. This interpretation reposed on the presumption, the a priori presumption, that Ahura Mazda, dominating the religious realm in the inscriptions, ought to have been equally predominant in the Elamite tablets, even though his name was only infrequently mentioned therein. The land service, however, is now proven to have been the vehicle of the cultural services of many gods, and not exclusively the monopoly of Ahura Mazda. This apparently modest remark had the power to throw into disarray many of our prior perceptions of Achaemenid religion. It allowed for that faction of scholarship which evaluated the Achaemenid world primarily through the prism of Persian and Elamite acculturation to define the plurality of divinities populating Persepolis' administrative records as the only theologically relevant reality for the Persian ethnos, an idea which adequately making allowance for the process of acculturation between the Iranian and Elamite elements, was nonetheless withdrawing the Achaemenid res religiosa from further definition as part of the larger tapestry of Iranian religions itself. Equally unresolved remained the manifest connection of the religious tenets and phraseology used in the inscriptions with the tenor of Zoroastrian holy scriptures, the Avesta. Thus, the worthy idea that the Persian ethnos had indeed changed through its encounter with the Elamite element, so probably also its religious beliefs, led ironically to the result that it deemed it methodologically unsound to query what it had changed into, beyond what the confines of the Elamite tablets allowed us to discern. Did the Achaemenids relate to the larger Zoroastrian or Mazdayazian religion, or was theirs a particular form and expression of Iranian Mazdayazianism? All these seem to be now questionable, and questions for the unsophisticated minds of which I am one. There is no doubt that with all the talk about Persian and Elamite acculturation, we have tacitly agreed to the preponderance of the Elamite element even in the religious sphere, just because Humban, the major Elamite god, is more often mentioned than Ahura Mazda in our equations. But acculturation can go both ways. If you are again, in the name of methodological rigor, obliged to investigate whether or not the multiplicity of divinities may be explained within the confines of Zoroastrianism, that is the world of the young Avesta. Here I have to take my audience on yet another journey. This one is going to be very brief. That of the Avestan scriptures. In a nutshell, and that is not beyond that, the Avestan corpus consists of two chronologically distinct groups of texts. The Old Avesta, which we date to the second half of the second millennium, BC obviously, and consists of the Gathas, some ritual metrical texts, and the so-called Yasna Haptankaiti. The Yasna with the 7 chapters, composed in archaic rhythmic prose. The indigenous tradition attributes the Gathas to Zarathustra, who is mentioned in them, while no authorship is claimed for the Yasna Haptankaiti. And the Young Avesta, which contains a great variety of texts, such as hymns to individual deities, prayers and litanies, religious and legal texts, and mythical narratives, and slightly older than, is slightly older than the Achaemenid text, slightly, maybe by a century or two. These two bodies of texts have been compiled to form a canon, possibly before the Achaemenids, but at the latest in early Sasanian times, that is by the 3rd century CE. This canon, however, was foremost used as a recitative, applied in liturgical practice. And the most important of these liturgies was the so-called Yasna, the celebration which not only initiates the long liturgy in praise of Ahura Mazda, but also thereupon praises numerous other divine entities. Thus, there is no inherent reason for us not to contemplate that what we see in the Elamite tablets as the land service, a major sacrifice for the gods of the acculturated Persians, is in reality a variant of the Yasna itself, as just been suggested a week or two ago by, at least that is how it's discovered by Jean Kerens just recently. As in both, that is in the Yasna and in Lan, Ahura Mazda is praised, but is not the exclusive recipient of sacrifice. For other divine entities worthy of sacrifice are also populating the liturgies. This proposition would also have the benefit to reconcile the Elamite cultural practices and services with as shown on the tablets with the tenets of the Achaemenid inscriptions. But beyond all, and returning to our initial inquiry, considering the land service to be compatible with the Yasna, means that we could make the Iranian religious world, which during the Achaemenid period could have been akin to the world of the young Avesta, possibly responsible for the ability of the Persian ethnos to assimilate the Elamite pantheon, or at least part thereof. If such a proposition were to be tenable, then we would have to consider the nature of the Persian religion before and after empire, as that particular ingredient allowing for the coexistence of other religious practices as long as they were ordered according to Arta and encompassed by the king's laws, the Data. Hence replicating our Ramaza's ordering the entire cosmos. I think I have lost my sentence. If you don't mind, I'm going to go back and look at my sentence because it doesn't make much sense that I cannot end it. It was supposed to be a punch. So I forgot the punch.
You're writing in German and you need to find the verb.
That's it. Where do I put the verb? Let me just... Okay, I think I'm going to just repeat it a bit differently. Less Germanically. So if such a proposition were to be tenable, then we would have to consider the nature of the Persian religion before and after empire as that particular ingredient allowing for the coexistence of other religious practices, as long as they were ordered according to Arta and encompassed by the king's laws, as replicating our Mazda's ordering the entire cosmos. Thank you so much.
Are there any questions for our speakers? I'm looking particularly for the student body back there because I'd like them to contribute.
Hi. The question is for Dr. Rahim Shaigan. And you had mentioned religious tolerance and sort of religious freedom as an embedded aspect of Zoroastrianism or Persian religion. But I was wondering, you also mentioned something about self-governance in the Greek city-state in the early part of your presentation. And I just wanted to ask you what you thought about, whether you thought there was a difference between religious freedom and, for example, military or economic freedom. Because I kind of see those as different domains, and I know that you mentioned, you spoke a lot about religious freedom, and for some of the areas, religious freedom may have been quite important, and we're willing to pay tribute or to continue to have that sort of freedom. But other, maybe like Greeks, maybe they wanted other kinds of freedoms, like economic freedom or something, and paying tribute would have been in direct conflict, something like that. So I just wanted to know what you were.
Yeah, I'm trying to the two domains, there's no doubt. But I'm not really interested about military or freedom in that sense. The only thing that was of interest to me is whether there is a connection between the inherent nature of the one religion that we think might have been, or that is shown to us through the so-called Elamite tablets and inscriptions. And like on the one hand, this diversity of gods being surfaced by that inscription, at the same time, Abraham Mazda would be supreme, whether these two can be combined and what picture would they show. The combination shows probably could be akin to something that we have seen in the younger Avesta, the Abraham Mazda is more supreme, the sacrifice of aid made also for other divinities. And that allows a certain notion of expansiveness within the theological context. And whether this might have been a context allowing for the Achaemenids, or the pre-Achaemenids, the so-called Achaemenids before the empire, to be maybe, while encountering the Elamites, to be able to encompass some of the divinities as part of theirs, so that they become indigenous divinities, because their own intellectual and religious mindset would have allowed and would have had that flexibility to allow them to partake of that. They are not the same people as the people who
Couples, the young adults that they are not, but that's not what I meant. It's just that they might be keen to a comparable theological context. The thing that is of interest is that within the inscriptions and what the Persians seem to tolerate, and I think my colleague Roses mentioned that this morning, is maybe in another context, but what they might tolerate is that which is ordered. And so you have to imagine in one cosmogony, creation is not ex nihilo. It is the ordering of cosmos. So everything has to be ordered. And so the Persians might allow for others to have their cultural practices, that means, or to have maybe some form of self-deterministic governance, but they have to be ordered. And that ordering means that they have to be approved by the central authority. And that ordering, to some extent, is what the word that comes in mind is data, which is the same, which is related to this cognate, the same word that Abraham Mazda orders the cosmos. So the datas are the laws, and it is cognate to the word of basically the word of creation by Abraham Mazda. So by ordering them, they are being approved, or they would be then sealed with the approbation of the empire and might operate. Now, I don't think that they really care much about what that form is. They allow this to happen. And the entire question is whether there is a systemic nature in that or not. And whether we can build this to become a wider policy, or a wider theory of governance. I don't have sufficient data to mention that. That is basically the thing.
I have a question for Denis. You were, I think if I understood you correctly, asking why there were no walls in Kazakhstan. Is it possible that they didn't need walls? And this sounds flippant, but it is a city, unlike the Assyrian and Babylonian cities, in relative close proximity, tending to be at war with one another, therefore having to be defensible. With a city wall, in Pasargade, you find the city geographically removed from all this, in the heart of an empire that for Cyrus must have looked invincible and in no danger of being attacked by anyone.
I'm not surprised of the lack of rampart. I observe there is no rampart. Persepolis also is not fortified, despite Diodorus, despite an excellent article by Ali Musali. I think Persepolis was not fortified. And Susa is symbolically fortified. Amada we don't know. But Babylon, because the rampart was much older than the Achaemenid period, probably maintained. And in my opinion, this lack of rampart is quite intentional, showing the peaceful empire, and they don't need to have. There is no danger, no threat on the city. That's quite a political message.
I wanted to continue the discussion regarding imperial control and religious practice. Don't we have to distinguish what's going on in the center and in the periphery, or even outside the center? I would like to draw your attention to the Takultu ritual, the Assyrian Takultu ritual, where you have all kinds of cities of the empire, including
fantastic question. I must say that the prior article, or prior draft, was basically on that model. Before I got this extraordinarily short article by Jean-Pierre Lenz, which exactly too much to not incorporate it, and so that was out of the window. Now, the main issue is that what is exactly the nature of the Persepolis, of the Elamite tablets? Do they represent the empire because they happen to be just in Persepolis, or do they just represent the empire because it happened to be there, and represent basically the religion of the Persian Elamite ethos? And that is how you take it. And I think I am at the present stage thinking more the latter, that this is basically one of the mosaics constituting the religious landscape of the Persian Empire. In that sense, it would be a different paradigm than the one mentioned. But I can grasp it easily to the other side. Maybe tomorrow. It's just one's opinion changes so dramatically because so little material is there, and whatever one seems to read might push one to one side or the other.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, this question is to Dr. Schreiber. Thank you for your presentation, and from what you said, I am surmising that maybe Iranians introduced pluralism to the world, and the reason for Cyrus being honored and remembered and cylinder having significance is because that was the first time that the world was becoming familiar with this type of idea. I'd like to hear your response on that.
I would embrace the main tenets of what you say. I really don't know whether they introduced pluralism or not. But it seems that they're permissive, not just maybe as a matter of quote political calculation for sure, but also because maybe there is an experience before. There is an experiment with the Elamite contract. The Elamite contract is flourishing on the documents again in a different fashion. You know, the fact that we forget that most of the scribes writing Elamite on the Achaemenids are both Elamites as well as new Persians, old Persian writers, that for them to adopt the Elamite culture, both the written form as well as the gods, indicates that the culture that has dominated politically, whatever remains of the neo-Elamite culture remained there, they must have had a political overhand, and they have been very permissive with that culture by taking it over to some extent and allowing themselves to be affected by it. So the end result might indeed be something that we call an Elamite Persian acculturation process. This must have prepared them to some extent for maybe an experience later on with other cultures that would maybe evince a certain notion of, and I don't like that word, but faute de mieux, maybe of a notion of tolerance and something of the sort. And so the experiment of having been themselves part of an acculturation process, and maybe also endowed with a religious system that, although recognizing a supreme divinity, but nonetheless allowed for other divine and deities worthy of worship to be also included, would have afforded a certain laissez-aller beyond what we have seen in ancient
Professor Shaigan, do you think would it be possible to trace a parallel between the Persian pattern that you have exposed so well and the Roman Empire, in the way the Roman Empire for the first century of the Common Era was constantly incorporating other religions, other gods into the system, even from Eastern, I think, thinking about Mithraism, and the way the Mithraism also became one of the major, religious kind of identities of Rome at some point. So, do you think that it could be a recurrent pattern as a sort of imperial way of multilayering also, the relationship between a center and different cultural identities that have to be part of the same web, or it's something specifically, I mean, it's a part of it that is only, can only apply to the Persian case, and so Rome, according to you, is something completely different and doesn't really.
So I like the idea of the Persian Sonderweg. I always like that idea, but no, I think it is really a universal pattern. And so you're right, there is a lot of similarity between Rome, pre-empire, well, not pre-empire, pre-Constantine, and obviously aspects of what we see here. But the resemblance ceases to be there after Christianity is adopted by Rome, and Iran still remains Zoroastrian. Is that at least for the case of the Sicilians, we know that they are good Mazdians, and that we don't know about their activities. But for the Sicilians, we know that. And what is intriguing about the Sicilians, coming back to the Achaemenids again, is that within the imperial sphere, even if a political calculus is the basis of it, they allow for two churches to emerge. There are the dominant power of the East. There are the ethnoclass, the main ethnoclass, the Persian ethnoclass is as a majority Zoroastrian. But they allow for the Persian church to emerge. They institutionalize it in 410, in the Synod of 410. They allow the exilarchate to be institutionalized before that, and maybe that is a forerunner for the Christian church. So within certainly the Mazdian empire of the later Sicilian empire, that is comparable maybe to the Byzantine empire, the Christian Byzantine empire of Constantine and later on, the parallels do not exist. You know, one is dominated by Christianity, the other one is very much Mazdian. But it allows nonetheless for these two other churches to emerge and cohabitate its imperial sphere. So the question is this to some extent maybe a Haddaxian continuation of the self-same phenomenon, you know, or is that something entirely new within the late antique context? But for those doing diachromy, and there are a few of us doing that, the temptation of looking at it as a continuity and as a Sonderweg is there.
Dr. Shaiban, I was very interested in the aspect of your speech where you were talking about how the different regions of the Persian Empire were allowed religious autonomy and cultural autonomy, because I feel that religion and culture are key definitions of a nation, especially back in that era. Do you think that the root of the idea of a nation state, an autonomous nation state, and a world system composed of independent and autonomous nation states originated in the Achaemenid dynastic rule? Or do you think that it's two phenomena that are very unrelated?
Maybe the latter. Thank you very much.
Last question,
Question for Dr. Bouchard. I'm curious to know how do you interpret the presence of that palace or pavilion that you and Natalie excavated at the entrance of Tanrı, and how do you place it in the history of the site, of the site? I know it's from the time of Troyes, but
This is one of the results of the international programming of rescue excavation near Passalia. And one of the results was the small pavilion, in fact not bigger than the small pavilion in Passalia, but organized as a more suitable for inhabitants in several rooms. That reminds me the possible estates, as you can imagine from the Persepolis tablets, and this kind of estate, which also can be called paradise in some translated in Greek. And that could be the residence of local owner, noble of among the Persian elite. And in relation with the two canals, which could have been done by royal order, because it's a very huge investment, but for local agriculture, for several agricultural estates of that time. Now it could be also a hunting avenue as well, because it's located in a nice, not nice for us, but for the wild animals it's a nice environment. It could be also as well a hunting avenue.
Well, I think we've about reached the end. It's just around 5 o'clock, and we want to remind you that we start again tomorrow at 9:30 and talks beginning at 10, and that we have a reception just outside the seminar.
Yes, it's just on the terrace of Royce Hall. We have a reception. You're all welcome to share.